What's up, sluts? Welcome back to yet another episode of the SinemaSlut podcast. We got our dude Dane Keil here with us this evening.
Hello, and thank you for pronouncing my last name correctly. You're one of the few that does.
What did they say, Keil?
Keil or Kale, but
He's
I
not
mean,
a fucking
I've said it
vegetable.
on the other show often enough to where it must have rubbed off. But
Yeah, thanks for joining me, man. This is going to be a fun one. Dane chose the 1925 version of The Phantom of the Opera. This was directed by Rupert Julian with a screenplay by Elliot J. Clausen. There's several people directed or like uncredited as directors and for the screenplay. I'm sure we'll talk about them if that part arises here. But it's based on The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. It was produced by Carl Laemmle. It had cinematography by Milton Brittenbecker, Virgil Miller, Charles, Charles Van Egger, and it was edited by Edward Curtis, Maurice Pivar, Gilmore Walker, and Luis Weber. And it had music by Gustav Hinrichs. It was, of course, distributed by Universal Pictures with an initial premiere of September 6, 1925 in New York, and a nationwide premiere later on in November the 15th, to be specific. I guess we'll run through our, general first impressions and history with the film. I'll let you go first since you're our guest.
thank you very
When did you
much.
become acquainted with this and all that good stuff?
Well, as we mentioned a little bit, so this film was put out by Universal, and it was effectively the film that kicked off the Universal Monsters series or that tradition rather. Um, So it's kind of a historically significant film for a lot of reasons. And I mentioned the Universal Monsters thing because as a kid, I was getting acquainted with them. There was a book that I got as a kid that was called Monster Madness, not Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. And James has not mentioned that specific book. But it was indeed called Monster Madness, and it did have photos of all the classic monsters.
Nice.
And I actually did. He did a video about the Crestwood House series of books, and I actually that too was my first exposure to those classic monsters, even before I saw the movies. So that video in particular, I really, really related to because I would rent them from the library all the time, and kind of imagine the movies in my head just like he would, and then I would see not all of them, but a lot of them. Um, and so that was my first exposure to the Phantom of the Opera. Luckily, this particular version of it is public domain, so it was very easy to find even in the video store era. And they would have it at Blockbuster, which Blockbuster tended to have just the newest releases. But because it was 1999, the Universal Classic Monsters had put out 99, they put out re-releases of the tapes and everything, so I was lucky that I
Yeah.
came in at that wave where they were getting back out into the mainstream again. Now this one, because it is public domain, Universal doesn't really bother putting it out. They've made some licensed action figures with the likeness of the Phantom from this version, but in terms of the one that they really push, they tend to push the 1943 one, which when I was a kid, I actually liked it a little bit more because I like the kind of I like the look of the mask a little bit more. I like the fact that he had an origin story that we get to see. I liked the humor. I liked the it had a little bit of melodrama in it. Looking at it now, it's not really a horror film, really. You know, it has a few horrific moments here and there, but it's mostly kind of a melodrama. Now, as an adult, I like this version the best, the 1925 one. And I really, really dug it even as a kid because I grew up on black and white films, including silent films. And I really dug it even as a kid because I just loved his face. I think the makeup was what really sold me on it, as it did audiences even back then. Um, but now as an adult, I think it's not just one of the best Universal monster movies. It's not just one of the best horror films ever. It's not just one of the best silent films ever. I think it's one of the best movies ever made. And we'll elaborate on that a little bit more. But yeah, my first exposure to it was when I was a kid, when I was getting exposed to all the Universal monsters and just classic monsters in general. Um, and because it is public domain, it was even easy to find, even in the pre-internet days. And James, again, he did his whole separate video about public domain video art, and there was one in particular that he showed that I'm almost certain was the same one that I watched as a kid. But again, could have been any one of them because they made, yeah, anyone could legally make one.
Yeah,
So
it's like Night of the Living Dead. There's a billion reissues
exactly.
of it out there.
Exactly. But yes, a great, great film in general, and a great one to kick off anybody's love of classic horror. And we will dive into exactly why as we go along.
For sure. This is one I'm pretty sure I mean, I'd been exposed to it as a kid, obviously, especially that scene of like, his face reveal and stuff. That was sizzle reeled to death for years, it's like always in there when they show this, like montages of classic monster stuff. But I don't know that I actually watched the full movie till maybe high school. I think I
Uh-huh.
did like seek it out because it occurred to me like shit, we always see all these other Universal monsters, and Phantom just kind of shows up when they do a collage of them sometimes, because
Yeah.
you're right, they didn't really push this one as much as like all the other stuff. So I eventually got around to seeing it, and I think at the time it was kind of one of those things where like wasn't really appreciating silent films. Uh, Now I quite enjoy them actually, but back then, being a teenager, I was like I needed something a little more high octane. But
Yeah.
I did, even back then recognize that like all the sets are beautiful. This is obviously a really well put together movie. The makeup is still insane. I mean, yeah, there's part of it that's sort of comical. And I think, Jim Carrey with the scotch tape and shit growing up on that didn't help. But
Uh-huh.
I mean, sure, he kind of looks like he could be on some Halloween themed cereal box nowadays, but when you really look at it, it's horrific still.
Oh, totally.
And Lon Chaney plays it straight up unhinged at several points in the film. So it's just even, with the makeup or just in spite of it, however you want to look at it, his performance is still nuts. So
Yeah.
the Phantom certainly leaves an impression on you. Whether you prefer other versions of it or not, this one's iconic for a reason. I think I was exposed, well, I know I was exposed to a lot more things that were like nods to the Phantom growing up. So, of course, you have like Dario Argento's opera. You had the Robert Englund version of the Phantom or whatever in the 90s, I think it was. Stage Fright certainly pays some homage to Phantom of the Opera. It's just a dude in an owl mask in that movie. It's really good. Um, all types of stuff like that, right up to present day with guys like Chris Seaver doing, absurdist horror comedies that are tributes to it, like Phantom of the Grindhouse. So it's one of those things that, has reverberated throughout horror since pretty much the moment it happened. How many actual, like, official remakes of this are there? Just the one?
Well, so there are, and I looked this up because I do plan to cover, not right away, but at some point, I do plan to cover the various adaptations of the novel that there are, and there are quite a lot of them. There's over 30 film versions, let alone TV show miniseries or episodes of shows or whatever. There's
Right.
even more when you factor those in. Um, and so this is a very popular story to adapt, and because again, it was based on a novel, and this particular version, I've not read the book yet, but I do plan to. Um, but from what I understand, this one covers the events from the book pretty closely, and it does have the correct depiction of what Eric the Phantom is supposed to look like. Um, because like other versions don't have him look quite like that, or they do what the 1943 version did, where they have him look normal and then he gets burned by acid or something, and so it's kind of a two-faced thing, um, and that's what does it to him. Um, from what I understand, the book Phantom and this one are basically meant to look like he's basically meant to look like a living corpse in a way. He's got like the sunken yellowish skin. He's got basically no nose. He's got, the eyes that look really sunken in and everything.
Those gross
Um,
protruding teeth and
yes,
swollen
exactly.
gums and shit.
Yeah, and this version of the Phantom, they really got that right. Um, and again, that comes down to the makeup, I think, which was it was designed and self applied by Lon Chaney himself, which
Yeah,
is just remarkable. And
it really is.
it has really aged well. I think it still looks incredible to this day, and it's unmistakable. You look at him and you just instantly know what it is. It is perhaps a bit. I've looked at it and I've kind of thought it looked a little bit like the faces that like Donkey Kong from the original arcade game, like the illustrations of him. Some of them have made similar expressions, but I assume that that
Yeah,
was
yeah.
perhaps inspired by the film. Um, but it's just unmistakable. It's unbelievable to look at when you see him. You can't look away. And then the actual reveal of his face, if you watch it in context, it's one of the most shocking pieces of film from that time period and even today that you're probably ever going to see, mostly because the editing is so perfect.
Oh, dude,
They
yeah, they build the tension perfectly with their like reaching for the mask and almost getting it and then not. And
Yeah.
then when
And
he
then
stands
well,
up and he turns around, he's pointing at her. It's fucking bone chilling.
and I went back and I looked at that reveal moment, and then I paused and unpaused it, and there's only like a few frames where you see the mask on him. So like between the one shot and then the cut to the next shot where she actually takes it off, there's only a few frames where you actually see the mask on his face. So like when you actually watch it, it's just suddenly there, and that face that he makes is so scary and it's so horrific because he clearly doesn't want his face to be revealed, and what a face it is, because that's one of the things that will kind of make or break a Phantom of the Opera adaptation is if the face is not scary, then it kind of falls apart. Um, and I really did love a lot of people didn't, but I really loved the 2004 version that adapted the Broadway musical to the big screen, largely because that was my first exposure to it. So I'm a little biased. If I really loved the musical before that and then I saw it, I might not have felt that same way. But one thing I hated about it at the time and still to this day is when they do reveal his face, it's not scary at all. And it's actually pretty disappointing. It looks a little bit like maybe they were trying to go for the acid burn look, because he doesn't look like he was deformed or anything. It just looks like, oh, he might have gotten burned or something. And they don't really explain it, but it's still when you're upstaged by a movie that at that time was like pretty much like 80 years before, when you're getting upstaged by that, it's like, well, there's no
Yeah, that
excuse at
says
that point.
something. This it holds up, dude. I mean, even in this one, we've seen the face a million times at this point, but even knowing it's coming, like, still gets me like, oh man, this is gonna be bad, And it's a reveal that is held up. It's stood the test of time. We're only 4 years shy of this being 100 years old at this point,
I know. And
and
it
which
went
is
in public
crazy.
and it went in public domain in the 50s because they didn't renew their copyright registration. So that's part of why it got circulated so widely because, well, it could. But it also happens that it was just a really, really great film. And there are
Part of me's got to
plenty.
wonder if it didn't like start the trend in horror films of keeping like big makeup reveals like that secret from the cast and stuff, because didn't he like keep it secret from the girl and it just scared the piss out of her?
I don't remember if it was the girl
And then I know
necessarily,
he also
but
tested it out on like the camera operator or something like
yeah,
that.
well, I know the studio and everybody involved kept it secret from the public, obviously. Whether it was a secret from the cast, that I don't know, but
Yeah, I want to say I read that, and that just adds another layer to it. Because I mean, obviously, that's something they do in horror films all the time.
Yeah,
where you don't see the monster until the moment you're supposed to play against it. And I'm a big fan of that. Or
me
like
too.
not telling people when a jump scare is going to come, you know. Uh, it adds that realism to their reaction, and it kind of makes, just knowing that after the fact and then watching it again, it gives you that brief little moment where the monster's real, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and one of the things watching the movie again, one of the things that really stuck out to me about it was well, the big point of praise, not just makeup wise but acting wise, the big point of praise is Lon Chaney's performance, which not surprising, of course, because it really is that good.
It's
He
glorious.
Nobody in the silent era could do that kind of body language that he could do. I mean, the only person I could think of that could be up there with him, a totally different kind of movies, of course, would be something like, the like Charlie Chaplin, but those are not the same types of movies. But like for horror specifically, nobody could do that kind of body language the way that he could. And he just his performance is so commanding and so scary, but it's also really tragic and haunting. And there's just nothing else like it. It's got so much power to it. But then the other performance that does not get anywhere near
Oh,
the
Mary
the
Philbin.
yes,
Yeah,
because
dude.
she
She
looks terrified of him, like genuinely terrified of him.
Well, and even in the build up to that, she's got this unhinged, like squiggly eye, like head bobbing thing going on that she does when he's talking to her through the walls, like before the reveal, when she's still all about this help that he's giving her to become this, opera star. She gives it like this really unsettling quality to it. I think that, this bitch is a little bit crazy. Like she's just going along with this mystery benefactor behind the walls that's like setting up these horrible events to help her, rise up in status in this opera. I mean, he commits a mass casualty event with that fucking chandelier, and
Uh
she's still
huh.
just down to go with him until they get down there and she sees that mask and she's like, wait a minute. And I can't blame her. That mask itself is terrifying.
Oh yeah, which and that's one thing I as a kid you never really place that much emphasis on. So another thing that's pretty critical for the Phantom of the Opera as a story is what the mask itself looks like and how it's used and everything. The 43 Phantom, it covered his whole face, which I always liked that look, to be honest. I thought it looked really cool. The one that most people are familiar with these days is the half mask from the
Yeah.
musical, because and that was always a little bit odd to me because like so half of him is really dashingly handsome, and then the other half is like really deformed. Well, he's at least got the one half that works.
Right.
But like that always kind of gave off Two Face vibes to me, and but I like the fact that like in this version and in others that his whole face is messed up. Now this particular mask, uh, it's not my favorite mask just in and of itself, just because it's not really much to look at, but then again, maybe that's part of the point, and also because that look had not really been cemented in the pop culture yet, because the 43 Phantom, that mask is a lot more iconic in and of itself.
Right.
Um,
And the mask is more just like an extra bit of fucking creepiness, dude, because it,
yeah,
it has like these dead eyes. It reminds me a lot of Toulon in Puppet Master 2, and he goes around for most of the movie wrapped in bandages like the Invisible Man. So I'm thinking there was some intentional callbacks to this stuff in there.
yeah. Well,
But
it's
it's
more of a means to an end rather than looking
exactly, yeah.
cool or anything in and of itself. Now, it does kind of what I like about it looking back on it is that it does have that kind of dead-eyed porcelain doll look to it.
Exactly.
And there is something to be said for that because it's kind of the proto Michael Myers effect in a weird way, because
Yeah, for sure.
the whole point of Michael Myers' mask is that it's a blank face, without much of anything on it, and thus you project all of your fears onto it.
I
You could
definitely see
argue,
people doing that with this one back in the day for sure. It's unsettling looking, man, when you first see him in it. And I don't know why, they didn't go with a full mask. because it's got like that weird curtain flap thing
Yeah.
underneath the top
Now,
half of it. That's probably my
looking
only real gripe about it.
and looking at it again, also, it looks. I don't know if this design is what they were going for or if it's just coincidental. It looks a little bit like almost like a Chinese porcelain doll look, and he's got that cap on there that looks
Yeah,
kind of
that little
indic.
fez type thing almost.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of indicative of a lot of those kinds. I don't remember what that particular style of hat's called, but it's Chinese in origin, and I think they wore a lot of those in the time period that this was set in.
Yeah,
So
you see dudes with them in like smoking jackets sometimes in
and
these old movies, you
it's
know.
very possible, well, especially again, Chinese men of that time period. I think they wore a lot of those. I cannot remember what the name of it is, but it does look like it's at least meant to evoke that, if not actually be that thing.
Yeah, give him kind of an exotic look a little bit or something.
Yeah, and it's part of it also is to conceal his head, his bald spot, his receding hairline there.
Yeah.
So part of it's that, but also it's so different from. That's part of what I think makes that face reveal so special, is because it's so different from what you've seen up to that point, because that's a very kind of basic, almost like baby doll looking face, and you don't know what his hair looks like and everything, and then it takes it off, and it's like the polar opposite of that.
Yeah,
um
they project a lot of humanity onto him with that and the fact that they keep seeing that other dude who at first those ballet girls like think might be the Phantom or whatever. He ends up being a detective. I think his name
yes.
was like Leroux or something like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
part of the
you
secret
know,
police, and he's been on his trail for a while, which he's a cool character.
he is pretty cool.
I don't recall that they had a character like that in the musical or in the film adaptation of the musical, because I've seen both. I've seen it on the stage and I've seen the movie, and I don't recall him being in either one. But he's a cool character because he's a red herring, and he's a very mysterious looking figure in and of himself. He's kind of like the Van Helsing of the movie, if you want to think of him that way,
Yeah,
because
in a lot of ways.
Dr. Van Helsing is as mysterious of a character as Dracula, but on the opposite end of the spectrum.
It
And
stands to reason too that the police would be on to this at this point, because by the time we even get into the story, the Phantom's well known to be running around the opera house, and
yeah,
they sort of imply that he maybe had killed more people than what we see in the movie, you know.
yeah. Well, but again, he's still the subject of folklore and skepticism and rumor and all that stuff, so that a lot of people don't believe he's real. And, and then of course the new owners of the opera house don't take it seriously. They don't take the whole box 5 will be kept empty for me, that whole thing. They don't take that seriously, much to their dismay and doom. Um, but most of the public these days, not at the time that this film was made, and certainly not through most of the 20th century. Their image of the Phantom might have been one thing, but for sure, people who are alive today best know the musical. But thankfully, the musical does follow the story very well. And if you watch this film with the musical in your head, you'll see a lot of just story parallels and sequencing parallels. More so with the musical, like the stage musical, as opposed to the 2004 film adaptation, because there they move the chandelier fall to the climax, which is admittedly a more spectacular place for it to go. But in, I think, the original story, this version, and in the stage musical, that's the act one ending. And then after that's done, then it's like, well, where's act two gonna go? Because you'd have thought, oh, they saved their big climactic moment. They If that's how act one ends, then what's act two gonna have? So it makes sense there. And in here, if you clock it, at least the version I watched, there are a couple different run times for this movie, depending on which one you watch. But when I watched it, it was around the 26-minute mark, which is still pretty early on. So the fact that they get their big spectacle scene out of the way, it kind of helps you to wonder, well, where's the film going to go now? And I
Yeah.
think that was actually a wise
What can they
decision.
possibly do to top this? And I think that they do with the especially the final climax that we get. The way I
Yeah.
understand it, this one is actually fairly accurate to the book, with the exception of the ending,
Uh-huh.
which I want to say I read either on YouTube or somewhere else online that it was supposed to like have more of him like having a bit of a redemption towards
Mhm.
the end, but test audiences found it boring or something like that. So they put in the whole ending that we get, which is like the mob justice thing,
Yes.
uh, which is iconic in itself. You know, he does the whole, "Oh, I've got something in my hand. You know, I'm gonna
Yeah.
zap you with some magic or something." And then at the end, he kind of gives him that "fuck you" by like showing him it was nothing all along. You know, and then they chuck his ass in the Thames or something. Or no, this is in Paris, so I don't know
Yeah,
what that river
in
would be,
the
but
yeah, but the
probably equally as gross in this time period.
yeah, probably. Oh, well, the stage musical has it ends, I think, a little bit closer to the way the book ends, as far as like he disappears, never to be seen again, and there is more of an epilogue for him in the book, from what I understand. But yeah, this one does end differently.
I mean, I can see how
Uh,
fans of the book would want to see like this so-called redemption bit, but I don't know. I like him being just a creepy villain.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, but he's not without tragedy in this. I think that's one of the best things about it, that he does justice to both the monster and the man, because it's not one or the other.
yeah, I mean, he says like the hatred of men is the reason he lives like way down here under this opera house. He was basically driven there by people being dicks, you know, which
Yeah,
especially back then, somebody like horribly deformed like that, they were gonna get like either put on display or mercilessly ridiculed and abused. And
yeah. Well, the
he's an
novel,
accomplished musician from the sounds of it, and like master of the black arts. He doesn't have to take that shit, so he
and
just builds a sweet lair under. Well, I think he claims it used to be like torture chambers, right?
yeah. Well, the novel came out a few decades after the lifetime of Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, and certainly, the story is set in around that same time period. But it was point being, it's of the time period that those kinds of like carnival freak shows and stuff like that would have been popular. And I remember one of the big additions in the 2004 film adaptation of the musical was you saw a backstory for the Phantom that wouldn't have been possible on the stage, although they do mention it somewhat on the stage. But it's that, it's kind of this carnival freak show backstory, and it makes sense, because the time period would have been right for that sort of thing to happen to
Yeah,
someone like that. But again, he does have the musical ability, and you know, he just doesn't have the means by which to get his music out there to the public, and that's where he finds Christine. And you know,
that
so
does seem to be his aim, is to like have her be in this opera that he's writing or whatever.
yeah,
Uh,
he doesn't have the vehicle by which to get his music out there, and she needs someone to kind of allow her talents to bloom forth, with music. And so it makes sense why they would have a relationship of sorts, meaning, she doesn't know who her mysterious benefactor is, her angel of music, as the musical put it. But Yeah, so that makes sense. But then, of course, what's so great about this particular version of it, as opposed to, say, the musical, is that, part of it there, she's really allured by him, and she's not immediately freaked out, because in there with the half mask thing, half of him is like this dashingly handsome romantic person, um, but then here she's a lot more unnerved by actually seeing a physical person, not just a disembodied
yeah,
voice,
it's
let
creepy,
alone. And
and she pretty much faints, I think.
yeah, even before he takes the mask off, she's freaked out. Um, which I do tire of, the fainting person trope. It's a fainting person because it can happen to men too, although it tends to happen to women more often in movies.
I
I
mean,
do
I can forgive it here. It's the
I did.
20s,
I was gonna say I don't begrudge movies from this time period of that. It just got old over time.
And as we covered, that mask in itself is unsettling. I don't think she was expecting. I don't know who she thought was talking to her through the walls.
Oh, I know.
Uh, I mean, she had to have put two and two together and thought it might be the Phantom. I
Yeah.
mean, that's where it shows that she's kind of in a moral gray area as a character, and she's down to just flip flop because she's all about this. Even with him dropping chandeliers on people and shit.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
she's
just once she
also
realizes that he might be creepy, and then finds out that he's like this monster,
when
that
she's
she
also
gets over it.
she's also in a bit of a bind when we first meet her too, because she's not supposed to tell who her benefactor is, and she doesn't even really know, but she's already kind of under an agreement of sorts even when we first meet her. So there is that to factor in as well. But I mean, she also, just like anybody, she has her dreams of stardom on the stage and all that stuff. So I mean,
Yeah.
there's
She pretty
that
much
to
tells old
factor in.
Raoul, like, I can't just get married and shit. I'm trying to my life is the
Yeah,
opera pretty much. I love
yeah,
that part after, like, she flip-flops back after she sees the Phantom. That's so hilarious, man, at least in the version I watched, like, he tells her, "I'll let you go, but you gotta promise to never see your lover again," or
yeah.
whatever.
And what does she do? She immediately goes to him.
Immediately.
Well, but at the
Um,
same time, I'm glad that she did, because I think I would have thought less of her if she didn't do. I think anybody would do that after they've seen that. They'd be like, "Get me out of here! I need to be protected from this
Dude,
guy."
it's so comical though, because when they have that scene on the roof, which we do have
Yes,
to talk about the Mask of the Red Death and
yes,
everything
we
like that,
do.
because that's iconic as shit. But like when they have that scene up there and he's comforting her at the end, he has like his hand on the small of her back, and she
Yes,
slowly reaches down to his wrist and like brings it down and just holds his hand. Like, yeah,
yes.
I'm still not giving you none either, dude.
Yeah, I
Uh,
noticed that too this time. I noticed
this
that
girl's
too.
just playing whoever's gonna get her out of this.
Yeah, well, but so that I don't know which version you watched. The version I watched was and we'll inevitably get into this. There are a ton of versions of this that are out there in circulation. The one that I watched was the Kino Blu-ray edition, and I watched the 24 frames per second version that had the color tinting, and it
Yeah,
had the organ music and stuff like that. Very,
yeah, that's the
very,
one I watched, I think.
yeah, very good version of it. Highly recommend that to anybody that wants to get into it. There are quite a few versions of it. The one that I grew up watching was all in black and white, except for the Mask of the Red the masquerade ball scene. Um,
Which
I
was
will
red, wasn't it?
no. So here's the story with that. So there's an advantage and disadvantage to this. I genuinely like silent film color. I like the just straight black and white, but I also like the color tinting of silent films, because if it's used strategically to kind of indicate differences in locations, times, places, you can use it really artistically, and they did it well in the version that I watched, because it helps to
Yeah, I
set
felt like it was pretty spot on.
well, and it helped to set like when
Oh no, I think
something.
the ball scene is like an early Technicolor or something,
Yes, well,
isn't
that's
it?
that's
Yeah.
what that's where I'm getting at, because see, here's my point is that the color tinting allows for, like, if something's supposed to be at night, it can help more clearly establish that and give it more mood. If something needs to be lit by torches or whatever, it helps give off that impression. Or if it needs to be
Yeah.
particularly eerie, then washing it out in green and stuff helps to do that. The one thing that it does not do is it does not provide that kind of wow factor when they do show the early Technicolor or the early color process of the masquerade ball scene. When you're watching it all in black and white, like proper black and white, which is the way I watched it as a kid, and then they show that part which is all in actual color, not like hand painted or anything, because they could do early color, they would just have to paint every frame by hand, and it was tedious, and it usually didn't look as good. But it does take away a little bit from that wow factor when they do that. But overall, I thought that the color tinting, along with that one color scene, over to me, it overall enhanced the mood, because then with the rooftop scene, something that they did in the version that I watched was, so they have it all washed in blue, but then the
Mhm.
victim's cape is in red, and
Yeah,
that was
billowing
hand
all beautifully.
painted, which I
That's
do.
magnificent.
And I do believe that that was a restoration effort from the way that it would have originally appeared. So with that being said, it's like, well, that just adds a whole other dimension to it. That almost, to be honest, it reminded me of like something that you would have seen in like a Frank Miller comic book, like a Sin
Yeah,
City or like Spawn or something like that. You know,
exactly. That was the first thing that came to my mind was Spawn. Like somebody had to have. Well, I'm sure McFarlane's a fan of all this kind of stuff,
oh, it
and
has to be.
yeah, because there's very much that vibe of Spawn when he's always on top of cathedrals and on gargoyles and stuff, and
Yeah.
it's
Well, and I thought of Sin City or other later Frank Miller works because Frank Miller would do that like
like the
really.
red Converse and
Yeah, and, like, really, really, like, literally black and white, like, no shades of gray, but then he would do these splashes of color in odd places to make them especially stand out, and the fact that they do that with his cape in the version I watched anyway, the fact they do that, it just makes it stand out all the more, and it
yeah, it really
really
pops.
it's amazing. Now that scene is powerful even without that in just straight black and white, which is the way I remembered it growing up. It's powerful that way too, but it's even more powerful with that extra addition. And the fact that there are so many versions that exist because that's the beauty of public domain is you could do anything you wanted with this movie and get away with it. You know, it's okay. But the fact of the matter is the story and the way it's told are so beautiful and perfect, and it's an iconic story. It's so archetypical that you can do what you want with it, and you can make it your own, and the story is still great no matter what. So you can do like a. Some people have dubbed over it with sound. Some people have done like a sort of 3D version of it because there were two camera angles capturing scenes, and so they made a kind of sort of 3D version of it. You know, you can do
That'd
the
be neat to
color.
see.
You can do the color tinting. You cannot do the color tinting. You can do whatever you want, but it's just the story is still great. You know, there's not going to be like a oh you messed it up or whatever because it's just it's so good that there's no real way you
Yeah, it's hard
can.
to fuck it up, really. I mean, at its core, it's just this dude deformed under the opera loves this girl that's like trying to climb the ladder at the opera, so they sort of are working together, as a means to an end to get her up there and get his music out. She ends up realizing that he's like this deformed dude and betrays him, so he flips the fuck out.
Yeah.
you
Well, and
know,
it's we talked about this in the chat before we started, which was this. So, what makes this story so special? Well, it is an archetypical story, but it's kind of a reversal, or perhaps the splinter cousin of the Beauty and the Beast story. And what is Beauty and the Beast? It's about love conquering all, but more specifically, it's a loving female force that is able to reform a wild, out of control male force, in that case, a beast. And that is such a cornerstone of a lot of fiction. The case here is a similar setup of a loving female force that is not able to conquer all, not able to repair the beastly masculine force, masculine
yeah, he's too
character.
far gone. He's
Yeah,
already talking about being her master and stuff, like
and
right
it
out of the gate.
and
So
in fact she rejects him and is afraid of him, and so he takes the opposite path and spreads fear and hatred and destruction and all that stuff. But there's a tragedy to him as well. So it's not all that, but again, when he needs to be menacing, he is. But again, he's not without tragedy at his heart. But I just the connections to Beauty and the Beast are so important because I think that is what has made for its lasting appeal. And it's why the musical was so successful and why the musical has never stopped running and why it's I think the biggest like media franchise I think of all time, like accounting for movies and music and stage stuff and all that. It's a juggernaut of a property, and it's because the story in and of itself is so ingrained in our kind of collective unconscious because it's such a it is kind of the so much of it is a cornerstone of what makes drama what it is. You know, you've got a love triangle, you've got tragedy, you've got romance, you've got horror, you've got um beauty, you've got ugliness, you've got the cruelty of man, you've got hubris, all these things that are so important to drama and what make for lasting stories. And it's all in here, and it's all done really the best that I think this story has ever been done. Because other versions have come along, but they've never quite whittled it down to its essence the way that this film
Exactly.
does.
Yeah. Part of what makes this work so well is how uncomplicated it is at the same time. Like you said, it kind of lends itself to being reworked in whatever way you want to do it, as long as you keep that core of it intact. It's going to
Yeah.
work on some level, you know.
Yeah, this is like it's some you might be tempted to say, "Oh, it's simplistic." I would say it's more undiluted, it's pure, and that's what's so great about cinema from the 20s, 30s, 40s, especially the 20s and 30s. They felt really pure and undiluted because people weren't so cynical yet because they hadn't seen it done to death, and also because they were more easily able to get down to the basics and the essence of what those stories were about. And so the ones that work, they work so well because they are, it's not, if I may use a drink metaphor, it's not their movies today are kind of like Sunny D, contains 5% juice, and then
Right.
at that time it was like, nah, this is 100%, and in this case, it's like, yeah, this is 100% archetypical drama, done the best that it's ever been done, and yeah, it is the story. It is everything you need in a story for it to last the test of time, and this one really does. And so that's why I hold it up as not just a standout of the horror genre and a standout of silent films and of the universal classic monsters and all that stuff. I just think it's one of the best movies ever made.
Yeah,
um
dude, and it looks magnificent. I mean, we touched on like the different versions with the color tinting and stuff, but really, even beyond that, like the different sets, the opera house itself, everything looks absolutely magnificent. The chandelier they dropped on those people
I
was
know.
gnarly. Man, that whole scene just gets insane with people getting trampled afterwards and stuff.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah, just
I
everything about like going down to his lair and stuff, and how I forget the artist, but whoever that dude is that does all those paintings with like the overlapping staircases going in directions that
oh
they
and
shouldn't or whatever.
MC Escher.
Yeah, kind of. There's like that one background that reminds me a lot of that. Christine's bedroom that he makes for her or whatever with
Yes.
her little customized mirror and stuff in the wedding
Yeah,
dress. She
that
sees all that
kinda
and she knows she's really in trouble.
that boat bed, which, a lot of versions have thankfully recreated that,
Every
I
room in it actually looks every single scene, like every background that they have looks dope.
well,
I can't
so
think of any one that didn't.
a couple interesting things about that, because again, like the, the bed, I wanna say, was from the book, and, like, I remember the 2004 version had it. I think the stage versions have had it, so it's has a legacy to it. There's just a lot of standout things about the Phantom's Lair, especially, like, the little lake underneath the opera house and all that stuff that's been
Yeah, that's dope
preserved.
too. He's got his
Um,
Rambo scene where he goes with the snorkel. I
yep,
love that.
yep, and,
Dude, even the backstage like area looks almost as cool as down in the Phantom's Lair. Like they spared no expense with dress in this film. Like
well, and not to mention, so something that James Rolfe talked about, which I've since looked into it, and I don't think it's perhaps as egregious as he was making it out to be. It's still plenty egregious, but it's not like it's been erased 100%, was the fact that, the Opera House set was a standing set for a good number of decades, long after the movie was shot, and it was the longest standing film set in history. But then they what James said was that they destroyed it to make way for a Harry Potter ride at Universal Studios theme park in Hollywood. From what I've looked into it since then, I think that they disassembled the actual opera house set pieces, and then I think what they took down was maybe the scaffolding, um, on which those pieces would be. The rest of it, I think, went into storage. So, like, if they wanted to recreate it, they probably could. But yeah, the scaffolding part, I think, is no longer standing. But that part, you could probably easily replace that, and if anything, that part might need some more upkeep that it probably wasn't getting. So it's sad because that the fact that it stood for so long, and I want to say it maybe even had gotten used in other films and stuff, which would make sense to me because it's such a big, expensive set. Why not reuse the shit out of it? It's beautiful to look at.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it is sad that it's not standing in the way that it once was, but at the same time, I don't think it's like totally lost to time either. So they could put it back together if
Probably
they
not,
wanted.
you know.
They probably
And there's
won't though.
enough like images of it you could recreate it fairly accurately, I would think.
Yeah, but I mean, still, the fact that it did stand for so long, I mean, that is a testament to just what an
Oh yeah.
important film it is. Now we did mention the chandelier crashing and when it happens in the story versus when it happens in other versions. So the musical, it ends Act One. The 2004 adaptation, it's like the big climactic event, and that was actually lifted from the 1943 version, where that's the big climactic event of that movie. And for sheer spectacle, I can understand why they would do that. I do find it refreshing and again, I believe that this was the case in the book too. I like the fact that they get their big spectacle set piece out of the way relatively quickly, just because it does let you ask yourself, where does the film go from here? But then you look at the actual structure of key events on the timeline, because I have the movie up. Uh, right here, and I'm looking at when certain things occur in the timeline. So that one again, that comes in a little less than 30 minutes into the version that I watched with the runtime that it has. But they
Yeah,
don't skimp out.
about a
They don't.
third of the way.
Yeah, they don't skimp out though on the timing of other key events because the big face reveal, that's the midpoint event. And
Yeah.
so they place that very appropriately when they need to place it. And then the masquerade ball is a little bit more than halfway, and the Christine pledging her love to Raoul, that's about 2/3 of the way through. And then of course the whole climax has a lot of it's nothing quite like a chandelier crashing, but it's got a lot of really key climactic moments to it, like the keeping your hand at the level of your eyes. And then
Oh,
the
I thought that
scene
was so savage.
it was, and then the scene that stuck out to me ever since I saw it as a kid, and it still stands out to me today because it's so inexplicable, in a good way. And I love the fact that it is the fact that they're down there in the catacombs. They have their hands up at the level of their eyes. Around the corner comes that floating lit head, and he just was wandering down the hallway. And he says, I am a messenger from the shadows. Turn back ere ye perish. And it's never mentioned again, but I was just like, that is so creepy. Just like,
See,
is that
I
just.
thought that it was that dude that he steals because there's that part where she's like singing the opera and he grabs that dude from underneath his seat in the booth and then he pops
Mhm.
his head up and she like goes into this really like high note that's actually a scream, which I thought was awesome. And then I think right after that he snatches her. So I just assumed that it was that he like put that dude under some spell or
It's
whatever.
very possible. And that what I like about it though is
It is
that
bizarre though.
Well, what's so great about it is that, so looking at it again, it's obviously someone walking, so you can see a full body and everything. It's kind of meant to evoke almost like a disembodied head, but you can also see the full body. And you can see that he's shining a light in his own face to illuminate it and everything. So in the storyline, it could be like an actual spirit, or it could just be a random crazy person. It could be any number of things. Um, but I just love the fact that it's not really explained, but it also gives, at least gives off the impression of like a of a wandering spirit, whatever. So if, even if it's not literally that, it really gives off that feeling, and it's just such a foreboding thing to walk into when you're going down into the depths to face the monster.
Exactly. Yeah,
You
it's
know,
very eerie and kind of otherworldly, and it
exactly.
lends well to the whole situation. I really like when they fall into, was it the room of 1,000 mirrors or something he called it?
Yes. Well, they got
Like,
they got several things. They got the underground lake, as we saw before. Then you've got the room of mirrors. You've got the room that is extremely hot, and then you've got the room full of gunpowder, so they could
yeah,
explode. It could explode, and she gives her that choice of like, you turn the scorpion, it does this. You turn the whatever it was, the cricket, cockroach. I can't remember, but
I love that extra bit of theatrics too with the themed
yeah.
knobs, like it's such a badass supervillain thing to do.
It is, but the fact of the matter is it's rigged, because they probably would have either blown up or gotten drowned. Um, and but you've got all these like supervillain type traps there. So they, in other words, they use their big set piece, their big spectacular set piece. They got it out of the way fairly early, but they don't skimp out on the other bits of
No,
drama in
dude,
the
when
climax at all.
like when he that room's flooding, because it's kind of rigged in that too. Like I think he knew they were going to get out of the room with the heat eventually and end up
Yeah,
down there where it would flood, because when she does choose the one he wants her to choose, it like starts draining his black lake, and it all
yeah.
violently rushes in down on those guys with the gunpowder. uh, the one part that I didn't catch this time, like how are all the regular townsfolk made aware of the fact that he was down there?
Well, it was Joseph
Because
Bouquet.
as this is going on, the whole, oh, okay, the little handyman
Yeah,
dude,
yeah,
like,
Joseph Bouquet, he found the trapdoors, and so he was getting everyone riled up because he wanted
oh,
revenge
that's
for his
right.
brother. That yeah, that was a little. You could argue that's a little convenient, but at the same time, I don't doubt Joseph Bouquet's ability to figure that out, because he has to be.
Oh, he's back there fixing stuff, and
Yeah,
you know,
and that's you could argue that that's perhaps a little convenient, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility. And again,
we did get
even
a little like Charlie Chaplin style slapstick with that dude earlier in the movie too, with like one
yeah,
of those trapdoors that he knew about, obviously, like the regular stage ones.
yeah, there is. Again, it's not a comedy by any means, but there's enough comic relief in certain key moments to where it feels tonally balanced. And even you'll notice even the Phantom himself, which again, not a comedic performance at all. But there is something I really liked about, like, in the climax there when he has her to choose, he has such great body language and such great facial
Yeah, he's
expressions. So
gleefully like evil
yes,
right here.
yeah, he's gleefully evil, and he has that devilish twinkle in his eye when he knows that he's gonna put her in the no-win scenario of having to choose, what's gonna happen. And he just has that. You can see why. So Jim Carrey would practice his faces in the mirror, and he specifically said, "I thought I was going to be the man of a thousand faces," which is what Lon Chaney was known as. And Jim Carrey
Right.
says that I only got up to 150. And
It's
yeah,
not bad
so
though.
but yeah, it's not bad. But the point is, he was clearly influenced by Lon Chaney, as were whole generations of actors, of course.
Oh,
Uh,
for
but
I mean,
you
and then
but you
special
can
effects in general.
But it's not too much of a stretch to look at, like, Jim Carrey's version of The Grinch, and then you look at Lon Chaney's Phantom, and you see how expressive they
Yeah,
both
I
are
can see that,
underneath
and the body
layers of
language and
makeup.
stuff.
And Yep, similar, like, when they need to look gleefully evil, they can. When they need to look sad, they can. When they need to look mournful or whatever, they can, and it's underneath what I'm sure is layers and layers of makeup. That's not easy to do, and,
No,
so
not at
just the
all. And I mean, considering that, Lon would build and apply this stuff all himself, with like his little doctor kit of horrors, is just amazing. I know for a fact Tom Savini cites him as a huge influence. Like when he was a kid, he just wanted to be Lon Chaney, like making himself up as different monsters.
Oh, I know.
Uh,
Well, and just very
and so if it
briefly,
wasn't for this dude, we wouldn't have the headshot in Maniac. And I just think
I
that's
know.
awesome.
Well, Lon Chaney was just a gift to this world of his particular generation. But we have to mention the fact that his body language was so good because both of his parents were deaf, and so he had to learn not just sign language, but he had to learn just body
Oh,
language in general. And so that's part of why it was so good. So he was tailor made for the silent era when body language is all you had.
literally. Yeah.
Yes, and then, he was supposed to play Dracula in Universal's Dracula, but he died of throat cancer, ironically, at the dawn of the sound age. I think he had one film, at least one film that he spoke in, but again, that was when the throat cancer was coming along. But just he was a man perfectly suited for his time and place, and then once the times changed, then he was no longer with us. But there's a certain bit of poeticism to that in a weird way. But
Yeah,
again,
I mean, it's who's to say how he would have fared in the talkies, like, full time.
yeah, that I
Maybe it would
can't
have
say.
tarnished his legacy.
Or not, or
It could have
maybe,
been for the best.
or not, could have been like a Charlie
Yeah, I
Chaplin
mean, that's
who,
what makes it
yeah,
fascinating. It could have went either way, and uh, the dude certainly was a treasure.
he
Because
most
this
definitely
isn't even,
was.
there's a reason he had that moniker, the Man of a Thousand Faces. If you've not been exposed to other Lon Chaney makeups, you should take a little Google image tour and enjoy. It's some quality classic
Well, and he played
fright shit.
Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and there's the famous stills of the famous lost film London After Midnight, with that iconic look that nobody has really seen in its proper context because the movie, as far as we know, doesn't exist anymore. But that look is so iconic despite that. But yeah, his body language and his facial expressions are able to communicate so much. And I think a lot of actors today, they could probably learn a thing or two from him. But again, I have to not just give him all the praise because I don't think that his co-star, uh, her name,
Oh yeah, Mary Feldman.
Mary Feldman, yeah, she,
Yeah, she doesn't get enough credit, man. I mean,
no.
he's amazing, but without her, it wouldn't have the impact that it
Well,
does
and
at all.
and the reason why I'm citing Mary Philbin so much is because so silent film leading ladies, they tended to have a very specific look to them facially. They had like this very kind of innocent, almost cherub looking wistfulness to them at the same time. Like they all were kind of in the mold of Mary Pickford, who was kind of the first real starlet in the way that we think of it today. But she did kind of set the mold in a lot of ways. But I think Mary Philbin, I think she's doing a lot of very subtle things with her face, and a lot of people really unfairly decry silent film acting as just pantomime, or oh, it's just big arm waving and stuff like that. No, no,
No,
not
not at
not
all.
at all. Especially look at her performance because you do get to see more of, well, her real face, not buried under a mask or under makeup. But she's doing a lot of very subtle things with her
Oh
face,
yeah, her
especially.
eyes are darting around, and she's got this little swivel to her head when she's like listening to him through the wall, and it really cements like a subtle deviousness to her. Like you can buy that she's going along with this up to a certain point. I was surprised when she was still
Not,
down after he dropped the chandelier.
and
But
not only that, but then you see her curiosity upon hearing the voice of her teacher, and then it turns to being kind of creeped out by him, like when he still has the mask, because he like sniffs her dress and all these
dude, yeah,
other things that any woman in her right mind at that time period, let alone today, would be pretty creeped out by.
dude. To be fair though, Raoul was a fucking creep. Dude, you see that dude licking her tears?
Oh yeah, yeah. I
Ah,
mean,
I don't
you
think I
know,
ever noticed that. Like,
yeah.
just
I
he's licking
mean,
her tears and then he's blotting them and licking the hanky. That's a strange fetish.
yeah. Well, but it's but he's hot, so but
He did have a fine mustache too.
that he did. We could have talked about him for Mustache Matinee on the other show, but but you notice that with she very subtly escalates the reaction to him in a way that is believable because she's fascinated, curious, then she gets progressively creeped out, and then she gets that her own kind of devilish twinkle in her eye when she's like, just what is he hiding? And but even that, there's
Yeah,
a
it comes
lot
back out.
but even that, there is a lot of subtlety in her face that leads because they do pace that her reaching for the mask. They pace it out so well, and then once it's finally revealed, she looks genuinely terrified of him. Like I have not seen an actress from that time period convey that level of fear that convincingly.
Dude,
And
I'm
I think
telling you, I
even
swear I read that like she didn't know. Maybe other by that point, other people on the set knew what he looked like in the makeup. But
yeah,
I swear I read that she was a secret, and the dude he tested it on was like the main cinematographer dude. And if I'm
yeah,
paraphrasing, but when I read it, I think it said something to the effect of Lon called him into his dressing room, and he just went in there. I think he probably had like a cup of coffee, a cigarette, or something, and just thinking he was going in there for a talk. And Lon waited until he got like a couple of feet behind him, and then spun around and did the whole phantom gimmick. And the
yeah,
dude like basically crapped his pants, fell backwards over a hill, and then he was like, "Are you crazy?" And
yeah.
Lon, because he couldn't talk with the teeth in, so he spit them out, and he's like, "Oh, you can go, George. You already told me everything I need to know," or something like that.
I know. Well,
I
I
mean, that's
mean,
just such fun, dude. I think it sounds like he would have been the funnest dude to be making these with.
yeah, and I love it when they do get that element of reality into the movie while they're making it because there are just certain things that you can't really fake, you can't really reproduce it, and when it's
No, I
real
mean
like that,
it's genuine fear, and
well, and
you can
it's
feel
the
it come through
magic.
the screen. You know,
That's when the magic
I
comes
mean,
in.
it's like I mentioned earlier. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if this was like the origin of that whole tactic in horror films. You know, because horror films were relatively new at this point, and
Yeah,
Lon Chaney was an eccentric dude. So I mean, again, you know, drawing a parallel with more modern horror, without that, you know, gimmick that he did with scaring the lady, we might not have little Corey Feldman shitting his pants when Jason jumps through the wall in
yeah.
Final Friday, you know.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, like, we talk about, like, Dracula 1931 and Frankenstein 1931 having shocked and disturbed audiences of the time in which those films came out. Well, this one was there first, and I'm pretty sure that this one shocked a lot of people too, and for
Oh, it
good
had
reason.
to have.
And for good reason, because like I mentioned before, the timing of it, the pacing of the reveal is so perfect where it's pretty hard not to be shocked by it because it happens so quick. But what's brilliant about it is that it doesn't stop with just a simple scary face reveal. The fact of the matter is, he turns around and he points at her with that accusing, look in his eyes, and you get to see it. And there's that one shot where it's a little bit out of focus too,
Yep.
but it's
He's
like,
so into it, he like walks through a stool and knocks it over. Like
yes,
it's intense, man. And in the sizzle reel stuff, you tend to just see the reveal where he spins around. You know, seeing the
yeah,
full scene in all its glory really is a startling affair.
it's powerful too because it's like he's pointing at her for a long time and he's accusing her, and it really puts you in. her mindset, and there's something to be said for creating a face that is genuinely scary and having people just stare at it, and having it stare into your soul and everything. And that's what he even says to her, at one point. And that's just such a magical thing, I think. Because
Oh, dude,
there's
yeah, and she falls down, and he like, walks over and grabs her head, and, like, jerks her face and forces her to look at him and stuff. I mean, it's when you put yourself in the position of her possibly not having known what he looked like beforehand, and then
yeah,
this is all playing out, like, I'd have probably still been legit scared that he was gonna do something crazy, you know?
feast your eyes, glut your soul on my accursed ugliness. Oh, what a great line. And that's what it does. That's why that scene's so powerful. Um, the other big standout moment as far as his face, well, two standout moments, is the look on his face when he's overhearing their conversation on the roof and he just looks crushed at the fact that she
Yeah.
betrays him. But then the other thing is when she's having to make her choice of which knob she's going to turn and everything, and he has that arms crossed. That's the image that they used in all the promo stills and all that. The arms crossed, kind of pouting almost look to him, you know, so expressive and so many
Yeah, it's
emotions
amazing,
all.
actually, because he's not obviously not in, like, a full prosthetic gimmick. It was 1925, but he's got a few layers of makeup on. And there's people that even with high tech like second skin type makeup have a hard time emoting as much through it as this dude is.
I know.
It's a sight to behold, man.
He's a master, simply a master. And not we mentioned the actual climax of the carriage chase. The fact that that doesn't quite end the way that the book ends or other versions end, but just as a we mentioned that they could have gotten their big spectacle set piece. They could have done saved that, but they don't skimp out on the spectacle with the actual carriage chase either. Like it's exciting. It's well
Oh
paced.
yeah. She jumps out of it at speed, it flips over, and then he jumps out of it and comes back for her and then notices that he's gonna be like overwhelmed by the crowd. It's yeah, the chandelier would have still been rad as like a final set piece or whatever. But like you said, this doesn't skimp at all. You don't feel like you were cheated out of like an awesome climax, especially
No,
between all the stuff down in the dungeons and then leading into this. It's like really once it gets going towards the end there, it stays at a steady clip of craziness until the finale.
yeah. Well, and the various versions of them. Some of them move a little quicker. Some of them are a little bit slower. The one that I watched is, I think, the best paced one that I saw. So it was the Eastman print, which was the best preserved version. There's two versions. There's that one, and then there's the other like original 1925 version that isn't as well restored, and it has a lot of the same, just basic elements, but it's just they're different takes of it, and they're in a slightly different sequence and everything. The image quality is not as good. So there's that, and then there's other ones that are projected at different speeds. Like there's a 20 frames per second, which is a couple, maybe 20 or so minutes longer. The one that I watched, it clocked in like I forget, it was either an hour and a half or
Hour
like
and
an hour and
31,
yeah,
34, something like
something
that.
like that. Well, but it's well paced. Like it doesn't overstay its welcome. It hits all the beats at the right spots that you'd want them to hit. Um, it moves, and but it still allows certain moments to breathe when they need to breathe and everything. But I like the fact that it feels like a last stand for him, because they make it seem like he has something in his hand, but he doesn't, and
I love that so much, man. It's so like again, gleefully sort of sinister. Like he knows he's gonna get owned, but he has to get that one last middle finger to the crowd
yeah,
and prove that he can command them one last time with just sheer terror. And
exactly.
it's such a probably one of the most gangster ways any villain in any horror film has ever gone out, honestly.
Well, but again, not without that tragedy too, because these are the same people that would have scorned him made him the way that he was. So it is like he is getting the last laugh, even though he does get
Yeah.
beaten up and thrown in the
For one
river.
last minute, he had him in the palm of his hand,
Quite
and
literally, yeah.
exactly. I
But
love how
it's
he just throws his head back and laughs and kind of falls back into the crowd, almost like he's gonna crowd surf or something. It's
yeah.
great.
Well, because he got basically what he wanted, even though it does result in his death, but it was more like a moral victory in his eyes. And no, it's just it's a perfect story, really. It's just
It really is.
it's everything you'd want a movie to be, let alone a horror film, let alone an adaptation of a novel. And it's got everything. It's a great story. And I feel like out of all silent films that I've seen, I think it ages among the best out of any of the silent films that I've seen, largely because the story is so timeless.
True. And I mean, we can't go without mentioning. I mean, a lot of the music is pretty great, but that Phantom theme, I think it's Don Juan Triumphant, he's calling it in there.
Yes.
That is still just such a great piece of organ music. And
Yeah.
you listen to it and you can hear little shades of like later horror type music. There's a little bit of that Psycho Reanimator vibe like laced in there somewhere that hasn't quite been figured out yet.
Well, and that's now that is one thing that is not we're not really able to talk about categorically for the simple reason that because it is public domain, I think because the original sheet music, I don't know if it necessarily exists anymore or even if it does, where one can easily find it or whatever, because that's a whole other aspect of silent films in general that they had the separate sheet music that would play in the theater and some of that survives, a lot of it doesn't, and even if it does
Well, the
survive,
version of it that because it
yeah,
sounds like we watched the same
I
version. The,
think we
the the one
did,
that I
but
watched was like only a few years old as far as the rip goes, and it was like
yeah,
720 or 1080p. Had the
yeah,
same tinting, it sounds like. So
yeah. Well,
whatever that
it
piece
had
of music is.
the organ music, which yeah, that's why I was so glad to watch the one that I did. Which now Kino, they tend to do the best restoration jobs for silent films, and with the music and everything. I think that is probably the one we watched, and if it is, then that score really matched up with what you're seeing on screen really, really well.
It did.
Now, again, I can't say that necessarily categorically because watched the film with different scores, some of which are just like only organ music and no other instrumentation. I've listened to ones that they just play like Schubert classical music underneath it. And in fact, for my own silent film Aeternus, I found a version of it that I think was from one of those public domain DVD sets. Like one of the ones that's pretty easy to find. So I was like, well, this public domain film, this particular version of it seems like it's the most commonly circulated one, so I can probably use this particular score, and it's all classical music and all that stuff. Like they were using a lot of
Oh yeah, but
Schubert pieces and stuff, but that's kind of where I was going with like you
I
can
think the
put
the print whatever version we're watching,
yes,
it's probably been because it's like that organ music that you associate with Phantom.
yes, it
It's
matches up
so that's
really, really
probably
well.
been in the versions that had the organ music for a long time. So I imagine like little Danny Elfman or Richard Band or people like that were hearing that growing up. And like I said, you could hear sort of the DNA of some of those later horror themes in that piece of organ music. And
Totally,
I just think that
totally.
that's super cool. Also sounds like every Cradle of Filth album ever for a few years there. There was
Yeah.
like that general universal sort of organ music vibe to them, and
Well, but
good times.
one of the great things about again the film being in as great a shape as it is story wise, let alone color tinting, no color tinting, this, that, or the other thing. The fact of the matter is that again, it's not made or broken by the score that you have. Now, it's greatly enhanced if you have one that does match really
Yeah,
well.
but if you don't, it's still going to be a banger.
Exactly, and even the one that I lifted the classical pieces from for my movie, it did match up in some surprising places, even though it wasn't written specifically for the movie. Now the one that we watched, I think on the Kino one, it's always best when it does match up to specific moments and events, just because it enhances the experience. But it is not. Unfortunately, most silent films are not in as good a shape musically as, say, Charlie Chaplin films, where Charlie Chaplin wrote his own scores, and those tended to survive the test of time a lot better, just because it was all kind of in the family in that respect. And his
Some of
also
them, it
were
very much feels like you said they're just plugging music in there, so it's not silent,
exactly
you
well,
know.
and
And
Charlie
there's moments in
Chaplin's
this where it feels like that. There's moments in this where it matched up so good you could almost say it's not a silent film for a minute, like during like that one opera scene with
yes,
Carlotta or whatever her name was.
yes, and now Charlie Chaplin films, like, they were also the scores were written in such a way that certain sounds would explicitly match up with certain visual
Right.
gags and stuff like that, and that's
Well, he's
not
like on the inside writing for it though, right?
exact.
Like,
That's what I'm saying. It's like that's a kind of a specific thing, but that's also, I think, why those particular pieces of sheet music had a better chance of lasting in a way that your conventional silent film score would not. But the one that we
right.
both watched for this film does match up very well, and it does enhance the story. It does enhance the mood, and it just
Yeah, I
goes to
especially
show.
like what's it, Carlotta's mom when she comes in. It's got like this old timey Darth Vader vibe to it
Yeah,
almost.
it does.
She
Now,
comes in to do her finger wagging at the opera owners or whatever.
and that is an interesting. I don't know if it's this way in the book or not, but here it's Carlotta's mother that's taken the heat as being the heavy, that's looking out for her daughter's interests, and she will sing no matter what. And then, like, I'm thinking in the stage musical and in its film version, it's always Carlotta herself who is the prima donna, quite literally the prima donna. Not just personality wise, but they and I assume it's probably just because it makes her more of a direct antagonist for Christine. And Christine and Carlotta, I don't even think interact in this version.
No,
Um,
it doesn't ever show them have a scene together.
which, again, not that they really needed it, but it does kind of create more of that antagonistic relationship that kind of helps sell her ascendancy to being the new prima donna. Um,
I got to give
and
Carlotta credit for like hanging in there and singing all the way till the friggin' chandelier fell.
I know. I mean,
But it's recent events that unfortunately have happened in the real world. You could say parallel that a little bit.
well,
Um,
it ain't over till the fat lady sings, and it ain't over till the chandelier falls from the ceiling. Which that line,
Holy shit, dude.
that line she sings to bring down the chandelier, I do believe was. I think it was from the book, but I know it's in this version, and it is in the musical as well. So it must be from the book if they lifted it from both. But or if both versions have it. But it's isn't that amusing that, yeah, with like Astro World and everything, that we are still seeing those, like,
Yeah.
but there no phantom required for that one though. They did that
Yeah,
well
we
enough
just
on
got
their own.
Travis Scott, and that was a lot less cool.
Yeah, they did that all on their own. They didn't need a phantom to help them out there. But one thing we have, so we did talk about the fact that, again, they didn't have anything else to show us. They had more to show us besides the one big set piece that they have. And we talked about those pieces and where they fall in the timeline. We talked about the masquerade ball and what a cool thing it was to see actual color film at that
It is, dude,
early.
and the Mask of the Red Death costume, which you
Yes,
mentioned licensed Phantom figures earlier, and
yes,
anybody out there listening, if you can find those Phantom Migos, the regular Phantom and the Mask of the Red Death Phantom, hook me up. I'll pay cash money for those.
yeah,
I had the Mask of the Red Death one in my hand, and I swore I bought him, but I think I ended up putting it back and getting something for the kid, like assuming that I would come back for him later. But the problem with those Migos is they're like in a section where kids just fuck them up.
oh,
So
I'm
if you don't get
sure.
them when they're like right there, you're gonna come back and the tabs are gonna be ripped, and I don't want to buy them like that. But
Well,
yeah,
and
really want those Phantoms.
Well, again, so Universal, they tend not to bother too much with this version of the Phantom, mostly because it is public domain and they want to put their resources towards
They
the
do
one that.
chuck out those figures from time to time, though.
Yeah,
I feel
the
like I've seen a
figures
few
they
others
do.
over the years.
The figures, for whatever reason, like I'm thinking more so for like home video and stuff, they tend to push the 43 one really hard because they still own the rights to it. In terms of merchandising and figures and stuff, they do tend to put more of it towards this one, even though legally there's nothing preventing someone else from doing the same thing. But it just, they, out of all of them, that's the one that I've seen the most is this
Yeah,
film's
you do.
version. But it's
Probably
there's a
because,
reason
even
why.
people that like, because, I'm not like huge. I'm definitely a fan of the movie, but probably not as much as you. But I would buy the figures like just from recognizing them as seeing them in clips as a kid,
Oh, totally. Well, but
So I imagine there's lots of people out there like that. But
not only that, but it just translates to action figure very nicely. Both the regular face, and if there is a Red Death version, if there is that a figure
it's
of that
dope.
exists, then that one translates just as well. And
Oh,
that
it's so
that
dope, dude.
th-
He's got like his velvet cape and his badass feathers and everything. It's such a good Migo.
it's amazing, and so the original stage musical. If I we there was my parents had like a version, or they had a original 80s Broadway production book of the making of the show and everything from like the West End and the original Broadway cast and everything. And so I looked at like the designs of the costumes and everything. The version of the Red Death there is lifted directly from this
Nice.
in terms of the designs and everything. The looks of the Broadway costumes owe themselves hugely to what they did in this film, particularly that costume. And
It's
the
so rad, dude. I mean, honestly, it's next to the reveal, my favorite. I think a lot of people's probably favorite portion in the movie. He comes out and he's like, you're basically partying on the crypts of the damned. I condemn your
yeah,
merriment. It's just so awesome, and the outfit is so dope. And then obviously that leads to the scene we talked about earlier with them on the roof and his cape billowing while he's up there getting his heart broken. But
oh
man, it's
yeah.
just such a good, like you said, that is kind of almost a set piece itself, just him as the Red Death. uh
Well,
it
and he
definitely gives you that shot in the arm to lead you towards the finale sequence.
well that and I don't think pimp fashions and stuff aren't really talked about as much as they used to be, but it's like I think pimp coats and stuff can't
Oh
hold
yeah, dude.
they can't
Pimps
hold a
owe a lot of their
candle.
drip to the Red Death for sure.
Well, they can't hold a candle to that in terms of just awesome kind of flamboyance and everything, but
No,
also
not at all. It's
being
so dope.
badass at the same time.
It'd be a fun Halloween costume, albeit like a high maintenance one for sure, because of just how much.
Totally. Well, and just the
But
look of the actual skull itself,
it's so sick,
it
so
really
sick.
is. Well, that's the thing. Like, again, it's an old film, not really graphic or anything, and yet the atmosphere, the just impact of the character, the impact he leaves on the characters in the story and on audiences. Just so many horror characters owe their very existence to this version of this character, and like even something like Darkman, the Sam Raimi film, is
Oh yeah,
lifted directly from this, all the way. Um, and I could go on and on. There are, you know, pretty much every horror film made since this film owes at least a little something to it.
for sure. I mean, there's definitely, especially when you watch it with the color tinted shit and you see how the shadows and different stuff plays with that particular tint. I could see this influencing dudes like Argento with, movies he made later. Obviously, all those like ultraviolet giallo things he was doing.
Yeah,
Um, there's definitely the influence for sure.
and
There's
it,
just that, even that opening scene where it's like the caretaker down in the catacombs walking around or whatever, and you see the shadow of the Phantom go behind him, and it just plays across the back of the set, and then it comes back across again after he leaves. Like, breathtaking. I don't know.
oh
There's just
yeah,
something about the way that's shot and the way they use shadows immensely throughout the film too. because we got, of course, all the shadows of the ballerina girls running around backstage. You got the part where the one dude is like strung up there as the stagehand guy opens that big door.
Yes.
I mean,
Well,
it's just it's glorious.
and you've got the opening sequence, which I sent you the link in the chat before we got on. Because again, well, James Rolfe's a big fan of this movie, obviously, and a big fan of like classic horror in general. But he did a video about who is the Lantern Man in this film, and he basically the short answer is not only does he not know, but nobody really seems to know the answer to that one. But
I feel like it's that
uh,
dude that he snatches, man.
it's very possible. But where I don't mind the fact that it's in there. In fact, I think it helps kind of lull you into
Oh, it's fun. Yeah, that's good fun.
it lulls you into the atmosphere of the movie, and especially this is where the color tinting really comes alive because it's washed in red, and it's just ooh, it's so eerie. But there's all kinds of shots in the beginning of this thing that are so masterful with their use of light and shadow and silhouettes, and all
In
that stuff is
perspective, like,
yeah,
obviously that one that was like the staircase painting or whatever, that whole shit is just great. Or there's like that one shot backstage where it's like looking back into the mouth of this big stage piece or whatever, and there's like pulley systems and ropes and stuff kind of in the foreground, and so it makes like this layered sort of drawing your sight to the mouth of that thing. And then there's that bit where the door opens and you see the shadow of the phantom, and then it closes and the girls freak out. Like,
yeah,
just so cool.
it's just awesome stuff. I mean, I just it's why I wanted to select this film, for my first appearance on this particular show, just because this film has everything in it. It influenced so many horror films and just films in general, and it's just a great work of filmmaking in and of itself. I think everybody from cinematographers, directors, actors, makeup artists, everybody can learn something from this film. Um,
Indeed.
and it's just a standout in every way.
Well, and as we've illustrated pretty clearly, also just, the main thing you could take away from this particular version of it is how to properly pace like a story or a movie.
Oh, totally. This film's pacing is it helped to kind of define a lot of like what three act story structure became as film went along. And it's a great film in every way. Now I have seen several versions of the story. I've seen the 43 Phantom. I've seen the show on the stage. I've seen the 2004 adaptation. I've not seen the Hammer version from 1962. I've not seen the
Oh, I feel like I've
89.
seen that one.
I've not seen the '89 version with Robert Englund, which obviously came out in the wake of Friday the Third
I
or
mostly remember
Nightmare
the
on Elm Street. Mhm.
Yeah, I mostly remember the cover at the video
Yeah.
store, if I'm honest.
Well, there's that, and then one that I did see that is a really good version for what it is. It's really odd, but in a good way. Is Phantom of the Paradise. Came out 1 year before the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and it kind of has a similar feel to it as far as like being kind of a quirky '70s musical. Not quite as deliberately campy as Rocky Horror, but not that far removed from it either.
Right.
In fact, for a time, it was a double bill with Rocky Horror back when Rocky Horror
That'd have
was
been
not
dope.
well, back when it was not doing especially well in its original wide release format. And then they realized, oh, wait, we should just make this a midnight movie. And then that became a tradition. And then it became hugely, hugely profitable just gradually. But it was a double feature with it for a time on college campuses and stuff. But it reimagines the story as more of like a rock opera. Um, and the Phantom there has, like, this weird helmet, and he speaks with, like, this synthesizer, and, he's got these sharp teeth and stuff like that. It's kinda odd, but it's fun and quirky in that '70s rock opera kinda way.
Yeah, it's
Um,
had like a resurgence these last few years. I think somebody like Shout or Arrow, somebody put out like a new like release of it. So,
yeah, well,
you know,
Scream Factory did in the US, and I think Arrow did in the UK,
there you
but
go. Yeah, you're seeing more fandom like develop for it these past
Yes.
few years because of that, which is rad.
But you see what I'm getting at though is that you can do like you can do a 40s Technicolor melodrama version of it. You can do a 60s Hammer, trying to make them a little bit more badass, a little bit more graphic for the time. You can do like a 70s rock opera version, a 80s kind of slasher version, multi-billion dollar, stage musical that had a successful film
I'd like to see
adaptation.
a dystopian fucking post-apocalyptic black metal version of
Hey, why
the Phantom
not?
of
I
the
mean, the
Opera.
story's classic enough that it could work, trust me. I mean, apparently even Alvin and the Chipmunks did a version of it.
Oh shit, I think I kind of remember that actually.
Yeah, so I mean, again, this thing is just so ingrained in our collective consciousness because it is so archetypical. Those archetypes resonate with people all over the world.
Yeah, don't sleep on it because it's a silent film. Honestly, it's one of the few silent films that I can like confidently say doesn't feel like you're watching a silent film necessarily through most of it because it moves at such a good clip. It's so
Yeah.
well put together. It's so lushly visual in so many different ways that you're gonna find yourself paying attention to so much shit that you're barely gonna notice that they aren't talking. If anything, it's kind of nice that you get the little text cards in between so you can just read those real quick and then get back to drinking in everything that they give you in this wonderful visual spectacle.
Yeah. Well, and the acting is so good just from their
Yeah.
facial expressions that you really don't need the dialogue, to be honest.
Yeah.
And
Lon
and that
Chaney seems like the type of dude, honestly, he's so good at it that it's not a hindrance to him at all. And if anything,
dialogue
having to
would have
worry
gotten
about
in the
stopping
way.
and yeah, it would just take away from what magic he's bringing to the table.
Exactly. So, I mean, in much the same way that like the stage musical version, people who like my mom hates musicals, but that she loves that show. And I think a lot of non-silent film people would probably be able to get into this as well. So it's a good kind of entry point for people to realize just the power of silent films and the power of films in general.
Oh, for sure. And then just, I mean, on like the collecting end of things, it being public domain, there being so many different versions of it, it's like endlessly fun to just keep buying them. I don't know that specifically from Phantom, but I've lived that life for sure with Night of the Living Dead because
Yeah.
similar situation. I don't think with them it was like a time thing. I think Romero just let it be public domain back then, so it would play
Well,
wherever people wanted to play it.
actually, no, that's not true. So what happened was, it went public domain. It was kind of a mix up. Well, this one went Phantom of the Opera went public domain because they just didn't renew their copyright registration, and this was back in copyright law for films has changed over the years. For most of film history, it was such that they had to put the copyright notice in the opening title card and the date and everything. It was that way for Night of the
Oh, it
Living
wasn't with
Dead.
Romero and them, it was just like an oversight that
Well,
somehow led to it.
kind of. So what it was the original title was supposed to be Night of the Ghouls, if I remember, and then the distributor at the time changed it to Night of the Living Dead, and they didn't put the copyright registration in the new title
So it
card.
like defaulted into okay, I
Yes,
get
so
you.
by a technicality, that's how it got into public domain.
I knew it was
That
something like that because it was like right away it was public domain, like not
Yeah,
even
and
any time had
it
passed.
pissed off both George Romero and John
I could see
Russo.
that. At the same
Uh,
time, though, it did probably lead to the success of the movie in a lot of ways because
yeah,
any like local station could just grab it up and
it
throw it
was
on there. And
it was a blessing and a curse because it was a curse in that it was a hugely profitable movie that neither George Romero or John Russo really saw very much at all out of, but at the same time, it was a blessing in that because it was able to get everywhere, that it allowed for their future projects, Living Dead related or not, to get made, and so that's why they both kind of went off on different. Evolutionary paths as far as the undead goes, because
right,
Romero did Of the Dead, and then Russo did the Living Dead, so that's how they split it up.
Yeah,
You know,
Return.
of the
Bless
Living
the
Dead.
gods for that, because both amazing franchises. But
Yeah.
well, to a point with Return. I
Well,
guess
but
with the Romero ones too. Actually, they suck after a while as well.
they both
Uh,
went on different kind of like
very much.
Night of the Living Dead's like the common ancestor as far as like it's not like a straight line for like a series, a singular series. It's more like an evolutionary common ancestor that all these other things spawned from, like Romero's own of the Dead series, which can hardly be called a series in the classical sense because they have almost nothing to do with each
Right.
other.
He went the class route, and the other dude went the camp route, and
Yeah,
that's why they work so well as like adjacent things to each other.
yeah, and
This
they're
was definitely a case of like, just like you said, right? The copyright sort of expiring, no one renewing it. It just became
yeah,
public domain naturally, as movies do sometimes.
yeah. But again, so public domain's a fascinating, wonderful thing, because it does allow for, enough time to pass for, the author to profit from it within his or her own lifetime. And then after that point, it becomes just part of the public consciousness, part of the public lexicon in a way.
Yeah.
And so that's
Like, I
how,
think we fully could have just ran the movie while we were talking
yeah,
about this,
we,
and let it play, and we
legally
would
we
have
could
came
have.
in just 3 minutes over the runtime, I think. So
Yeah,
would have lined up perfect, like Dark Side of the Moon and Alice in Wonderland or whatever.
totally. Or Wizard of Oz. But
Or yeah, duh. See, you
yeah.
got me in Alice mode.
No. Well,
More on that later, guys.
yes, indeed. Well, there is actually a 1915 Alice in Wonderland, a silent version of it that is really worth watching. Because it gives the silent movie treatment to that story and actually does a good job of translating it in a way that has that silent film mystique that can only be brought from that era. Um, Not quite as action oriented as this is, but that's also because Alice in Wonderland as a story is a very talky one in the way that this one has a little bit more action beats and things like that.
We also got to mention shit like, what's it? Isn't Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? That's silent, isn't it?
Yeah, 1920, so it came
Yeah,
out before this, but
that and friggin' Nosferatu are like the other ones that I have
yeah.
the most experience with.
And that one
Uh,
also came out before this. I mean, but this film would not have been possible without those two having come out. I mean, the German Expressionist films really did pave the way for much of what American silent horror would later become.
oh,
Um,
dude, yeah, Caligari looks insane.
oh, to this day it does. I mean,
Yeah,
German Expressionism, there's nothing better as far as silent cinema goes.
I think this stuff, I mean, I'm a prime example of it. I was aware it existed. I definitely neglected it. Like as a kid, I was so inundated with more, even like in terms of the classic horror, the more modern stuff from like the 40s and the 50s or whatever, into the 60s, 70s, 80s, all that shit.
Yeah,
So, and then with cable TV being a thing in our time, and me having access to it, because my parents were like the lenient variety, I was able to just watch all types of horror films. So I was spoiled on like more modern, talky stuff, obviously. And then as a teenager, you're kind of running a few years higher than you are later in life. So I wasn't trying to like have the patience to sit down and appreciate this stuff like I should have back then. In hindsight, I still think it's a good, point in my favor that I was actually at least willing to give them a try at the time.
totally.
Uh, you know, and there's elements of them that did appeal to me back then that still appeal to me greatly to this day. This thing being no exception. I think were I to choose between those three, Nosferatu is always going to be a standout for me because the fucking vampire is so creepy.
Hmm.
But I think that this is a better film.
Yeah,
I would say.
the pacing of it, I think, kind of more closely matches what a lot of films would later go on to emulate. It is kind of apples and oranges in a weird way because again, Nosferatu was kind of weird to think of it this way. Nosferatu is technically the first mockbuster because it never gets classified this way, but it kind of is true. because they couldn't use the rights to the Bram Stoker estate.
Oh, that yeah, duh. Yeah,
His
I was like, "What
widow
is he talking about?" But I
his
get what you're saying,
his
yeah.
widow didn't give them the rights to use to adapt the Dracula novel, so they kept the structure the same and everything. They just changed the character names, and they got a lawsuit over it. And then other later public domain prints restored the names to like Dracula, Jonathan Harker, Mina, etc. Uh, so it's like it technically was kind of the first mockbuster in a
Oh,
weird
totally.
way.
Never thought about it, but yeah, it totally is, dude.
Hmm.
It's kinda hilarious,
A
actually.
mockbuster that became as renowned, if not even more than some of the more direct official adaptations, because without it, you don't get 31 Dracula, you don't get any of them. So it's
Oh,
just
yeah,
fun.
and arguably Nosferatu's, like, the one true horror fans like, like 31 Dracula or whatever is dope, but, uh, I think you're missing something if you haven't messed with Nosferatu. And that
And
seems to be the ones that got, like, romanticized a little bit by this, I guess, the more hardcore horror kids. You see people doing it, like, redoing that sort of vampire design. They kind of saved it for like the more gruesome vampire flicks later on, if you think about it.
yeah, which interestingly enough, the look of the Phantom here has been often referenced and shown in different uh, pieces of media and clip shows and things like that. I haven't really seen that many people try to emulate the look, maybe because, vampires, there's more than one, obviously, but there's only one Phantom, so perhaps that's why.
I
But,
think that's a big part of it, yeah.
yeah, because, like, I've seen other characters besides Count Orlok have the Nosferatu makeup design.
Oh,
Um,
for sure. Salem's Lot immediately comes to mind, like the movie version. They
yes.
totally did that Nosferatu style.
Well, and it's because again, there's more than one vampire in this kind of fiction. But there's
Yeah,
really only one
the
phantom.
Phantom's not like a race of beings, or he's just a dude that is deformed for whatever reason and lives in these catacombs and makes awesome music and kidnaps broads. And
Yeah,
does a good job of it until unfortunately the handyman discovers his hidey holes.
yeah.
Uh, but I mean, I was
Before
somewhat in
he
jest
could
saying that, like,
before he
he
could
could.
discover Christine's hidey holes.
Dude, there's that one part where he talks about, hold on. Oh, my phone's not next to me, but there's this one part where he talks about, like, I've been down here spitting the toad and serpent venom or something.
Yeah, yeah.
But now you're gonna show me love, and it's like that is such a fucking incel thing to say.
I was gonna
Calm
say
down, Phantom.
I was gonna say, like, the Phantom I noticed that too, like, this time around, I was like, the Phantom was kind of the original incel in a way,
Totally.
but for him, it was, you have a totally understandable reason why, but at the same time, it's like he's doing all kinds of stuff. I was like, don't give this guy a computer because he
No,
would be so much
no.
worse nowadays.
He'd be in some dark corner of the internet. He wouldn't even be composing anything. He'd just be
Nah.
capturing women, documenting it.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't even. Maybe he would like physically capture. Nowadays, he'd just be video stalking them, or he'd be like, when he wasn't doing that, he'd be playing video games. He wouldn't be making art,
Well, and that
necessarily.
is a point that I wanted to bring up, dude, is you gotta wonder how many of those, like, especially like the Zodiac killer, might have been subconsciously even like influenced by this movie to write those letters, because they're pretty similar
Yeah, I
when you
mean,
think about it.
I don't think you would need because like,
Later serial killers would have been influenced by the Zodiac, but the Zodiac was like in the 50s, so there was no
well,
real
no, he was
precedent for that.
in the late '60s, early
Or
'70s in San
yeah, yeah.
Francisco. Well, but
Either
to
way,
be
still no precedent for it really.
To be fair,
So,
Jack the Ripper wrote letters to the newspapers in London, and there were no movies that existed back then, really. So, I mean, I don't think that's depends.
so that could be carryover,
Well, I
like
think that's a larger part of their psychology that's kind of independent of a
they
movie.
definitely nailed it in this one, because the Phantom's frequently sending letters to these people telling them that he's gonna
Yeah,
basically fuck them up if they go ahead with this other girl singing instead of
and that's a
Christine.
that's a function of people who are kind of narcissistic as they want to kind of show off their power and ability and all that stuff.
That makes sense. Yeah, I
Which
hadn't thought about the Jack the Ripper thing. That definitely I feel like would be, the origin of it in pop culture.
Well, and
You know?
no movie was necessary in that respect, but
Right. Yeah, but it
the
getting injected into, like, there's a bit of the Ripper and the Phantom when you think about the way he dresses and
oh
sort of the
yeah,
general silhouette and stuff.
yeah, totally, and the time period's not too far off either. All different part of the world, though. Of course, Jack the Ripper's in a real person or people or whoever it really was. No one knows, but like in Whitechapel and that part of East London, and here we've got Paris in France. So different part of the world, but there's definitely a carryover there. But then one thing I thought about just now, as far as writing letters and stuff, the letters here are relatively infrequent. They're placed in very particular parts of the narrative, and they're not. Every time they appear, they're done in a very appropriately threatening way, because that's what they're intended to do. And then I think about again this letters song that is basically just a big exposition dump in the stage musical, as far as like, because it's kind of a comedic scene where they read off the letter to the several letters to the owners of the Opera Populaire, and then a letter to Raoul, a letter to Madame Carlotta, all that stuff. And it's a very kind of a comedic song, and a very catchy one. But it's just like here, there's fewer of them, and they're just, when they appear, it's not a good thing. It's a
Yeah, there's
intimidating
more
thing.
sinister element to it. I mean, he basically does poison Carlotta at one point, and then the next letter says that she better consider being sick again for the next performance, which is just so savage.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and the other thing I thought about was, you talk about incels and everything. So, he's got his he does a lot of creepy stalkerish things, which again, not
he
surprise
really does.
well, but not surprising given his setup and everything. But he's got the wedding dress, he's got the mannequin of her, he's got all these things. And he's writing letters, and he's saying that she's a slave and everything, and she's there to make him happy, fill him with love,
Yeah,
all
so
this
you can stop
stuff.
spitting the venom of toads and serpents all around down there in the catacombs. Jesus Christ,
I
dude.
know, and it's like, I see it through a different lens now. Uh, just being a little bit more experienced in the world and everything.
Her reaction
Um,
to that wedding dress, and I mean, like, because she kind of wakes up and there's that brief moment where it's like, what was oh shit, this was real? And then she sees the stuff sitting there and she's like, oh, this is very real,
yeah.
Uh, because it's one thing if he just wants to like hook up once or twice. He's talking about marrying her. He's got like a little, luxury bed pad set up for her with that boat bed.
Which I think
How
most
do you get
girls,
all that shit down there without anybody noticing?
many years and not a lot else to do, I suspect. And I think a lot of that stuff was probably down there already, or at
Yeah,
least very
because it
very
was like,
very
the
close to it, because it was in the basement of the opera, so it's probably a lot of old props and things.
well, and he specifically says it's 5 cellars down. So you get the
Yes.
idea that this opera house was built on top of all these crypts and like multiple cellars from some royal type
Yeah.
castle, probably, or something.
Well,
So
keep in mind that it is in Paris, where, and this is not movie magic, it's a real thing. The Paris catacombs, there are
yeah,
tons and
that's
tons of
a real
bodies
thing.
and skulls that are underneath Paris. That's a real thing. So,
Dude, new ones get deposited down there because people get lost and never come
yes,
out.
it's true. So, I mean, but so that has a legacy to it
Yeah,
also.
that's why I
So,
love that Mask of the Red Death scene so much, because it's
oh
like
yeah,
it's pretty
totally.
heavy when you think about it.
Well, but it makes sense as thematically as to why the Phantom would feel the way he does, because if a city's as old as Paris and there's so much death buried down underneath bustling life and all that, I mean, that's a visual metaphor if ever there was one. Um, But yeah, just I think about a lot of just his reasoning and his approach to get meeting girls and stuff, and it's like, yeah, just
It's fucked.
don't give this guy a computer because he would be like the worst incel of all
Yeah.
time. He really
I
would.
mean, okay, listen, boys. If you got a crush on a girl and you're gonna get her a gift, maybe don't lead with a wedding dress, a veil, and a
Yeah.
personalized mirror
Baby
for her to
steps,
look at
fellas.
herself in the stuff. You know, like just take it slow.
Yeah.
Um,
Be a
I think,
gentleman. Don't be a creeper.
yeah, just don't be a phantom. All right.
Yeah, really.
Uh, I think, and we've touched on this a little bit, but Phantom's probably the most neglected of the Universal monsters in a lot of ways, or in all the ways,
Well,
really. I mean, everybody tends
in
to.
storyline, he's neglected, and that's why he is the way he is. But yeah, relative to the other his contemporaries, for sure, I don't think he gets quite the praise he deserves.
Not at all. I mean, we're all aware of him. Even if you've never seen the shit, you've grown up and you know who the Phantom of the Opera is. You've seen this version of him if you've watched any Universal sizzle reels or, I mean, but a lot of us still haven't seen this. We tend to get sort of bookended in that Dracula onward era of Universal, but there's a lot of stuff that came before that. Isn't there, like the Werewolf of London?
Yes.
Uh, Hunchback of Notre Dame was one, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, Werewolf of yeah, I think Werewolf of London. Let me see when that. I feel like that one might have come out after Dracula, but I mean Dracula. Where Hunchback of Notre Dame for sure did. Come out before Dracula, and Dracula and Frankenstein both kind of kicked off the Universal monsters of the sound era because this one kicked it off for the silent era. Um, but I agree that this particular one it doesn't get quite the praise that it. So that was
Yeah, they don't
Werewolf of
even
London was 35. So yeah, that was after Dracula.
and
But
it's still like one of those ones that it is on the list there of the actual Universal monsters, but all the stuff pre like 31 Dracula, they don't even include on like the official lists of Universal monsters stuff most of the time.
which
Which
again, very very sad, and that's I think
yeah,
part
it's
of
bullshit. This dude has earned it for sure.
Well, and part of again, part of why they tend to push 43 Phantoms so much is because they still own Universal still owns the rights to it. It's a talkie, it's in color and all that stuff, which is all great. And I don't want to badmouth it because it is a great film for what it is. It's just not the same thing
Right.
at all.
It's they should
It's
still recognize this as part of the official canon if they're going to show them sometimes and put out action figures and do all that junk though.
Yeah, well, it's kind of put up there with this pantheon of horror films, but really it's more of like a musical melodrama with a few horror elements here and there. But it's got a surprising amount of humor in it. I remember from I loved watching it as a kid because it does have a good mix of humor and some melodrama and stuff. And it actually did influence Joel Schumacher when he adapted the musical to the screen. Just tonally, visually, structurally, like I mentioned with the chandelier being moved to the climax, that was from that version. Um, so it's definitely seen its own ripple effect throughout film history, just of a different variety because it's not really the same thing. Um,
Well, that brings up a good point too. If you had to choose above all else, like above every other one like other adaptation of this to recommend people check out, what would be the version you would choose outside of this
well,
original
if
one?
we're talking just films, because I mean, if you're including all of media, well, everyone and their mother has seen or at least heard the music of the stage version. And I mean, even beyond just musically, I mean, because musically, well, there's a reason why it's so lauded because it's just classic. Every moment of it is classic. But story-wise, it hits the beats that you'd want it to hit, and it follows in line with this very nicely. And I would put the 2004 version in there as well, because it is a pretty faithful translation of the stage musical. Now, it does add some things, it rearranges some events and things like that cinematically. But and I know that there's a lot of people who like they grew up with the the stage recording, the original Broadway cast recording with Sarah Brightman and Michael Crawford and everything. Which and I wouldn't even say the 2004 one is perfect because like people have criticized Gerard Butler singing. They've criticized a lot of different aspects of it. I'm a little biased because I did grow up with it. But as far as I think you could do a lot worse as far as like translating the events. Um, and I think musically doing a pretty good job of translating it to the screen in a way that's not too long and it's not because a lot of Broadway adaptations they tend to be a little overly long and they feel too stagey in a bad way. But I think that it for me it does a good enough job with it. But again, I need to see more of the other versions to where I can more kind of more fairly answer that because then I'd have more to compare it to because I have not seen Hammer. I've not seen the '89 version.
See, I feel like I saw the Hammer one, and I can't swear to having seen the Robert Englund one as a whole. I know I saw it at the video store a bunch as a kid, so I'm kind of in that same boat. I haven't even seen like any of the ones that you're talking about, of the newer ones, but I can wholeheartedly recommend like Argento's opera and Stage Fright. Those Italian flicks that definitely take cues from this and do it in their own kind of giallo slasher fashion. Because
Mhm.
obviously, as we touched on earlier, certain parts of this had to have influenced people in that, sort of scene. I would not be surprised at all if color tinted Phantom was a young Dario Argento's like one of his favorites,
Yeah. Now
because oh, go
one
ahead.
interesting thing because like what you're talking about there those are more I think directly you could say more directly horror adaptations and
I don't
that's
even know
a
if I'd
little
call them adaptations as much as like send ups to, you know, Phantom.
well but they're more
Uh,
clearly in the horror mode because like
yes,
what I
very much so. I mean,
well
there's some solid gore in both of those.
because one of the things that was a criticism of the 2004 version, and you could argue perhaps a criticism of the stage show in general is that there's perhaps not enough horror in them. And I think that was more of a criticism of the 2004 one, plus the fact that some of the more unexplained mystery aspects of the stage version because on the stage like he shoots fireballs at
Hell yeah.
Christine and Raul and the way that he disappears is not really explained and that kind of stuff so there's some more mystery elements that are on the stage that are not in the film and you could argue that that could be a problem with it and I would agree that the 2004 one is probably the least horrific out of all them and it doesn't even attempt to be placed in the pantheon of horror in the way that the 43 one even does. And even then, it's not, that's a pretty shaky comparison in and of itself. But so you could definitely say that that's a criticism of it. I mean, it's got the beautiful visuals, it's got the gothic setting, it's got the usages of light and shadow and everything, but it is perhaps not quite as horrific as it could be or should be because then you
Yeah,
look
I
at
could
like
see that bumming me out, because this one, even this old, like, has that heavy in there, that element of horror. So,
well, and even like because I haven't seen the Hammer version, but I saw that mask growing up, and that's a really badass mask. As far as Phantom masks go, because it looks like a pretty worn, ruined mask in and
yeah.
of itself. And again, I do generally like the 2004 one, but I think the actual reveal of the Phantom's face is so underwhelming that for a lot of people, I'm sure it probably killed it. The rest of the film I do think is pretty solid, but I just that version that particular element of it is so weak in comparison to the other versions that came before. Particularly when you're getting upstaged by a film from 1925, that's saying something.
Yeah, dude, we might
Um,
even have to like come back around a few years from now and do this again just for the 100th anniversary.
We
Why not?
might well, I'm by that time, I'll probably have done my formal, deep dive into all the different adaptations
Yeah,
or,
that might be one of those rare times we'll let like one other person join us on here.
yeah, something like that, but because when I do that, I'm gonna want to read the actual book, which has been on my list for some time. But I want to do that, and then I'll watch the other versions because it is a public domain source. There are actually quite a few like indie versions of it that I like, modern day indie versions, indie sequels, and stuff that I've never heard of that do exist, and it makes
I
sense
think
because
you would
it's
really like the Chris Seaver Phantom of the Grindhouse, but it is not an adaptation at all. It's just the dude is in a phantom sort of outfit doing Michael
uh-huh.
Jackson dances backstage while he's killing people. It's hilarious and absurd and
Well,
gross, but
now here's one for you that I didn't even know was a thing, nearly to at all, let alone to the degree that it is a thing. So there's a Chinese film, of all
oh
things,
god, this can only
called
be good.
Song at Midnight, which is apparently a Chinese adaptation of the story. And guess what? There are like four or five different versions since then. Like there's a two-parter film called The Midnightmare Part 1 and Part 2 the next year. And then there's a Song at Midnight in 85. There's like a TV adaptation of that. There's and it's like, geez, I never would have thought, China and this particular story, which when I think of this story, I think of France because that's where it's set. Um, but I never would have thought China, let alone that many remakes and retellings of that particular
Yeah,
version of it.
if anything, I would think Japan sooner than China because of, just certain aesthetics of it.
Or even
Um,
its own native France, but then there's like there's a lost German version of it from 1916. There's a couple of Italian versions, not even talking about Dario Argento's opera, which I don't know if you'd call that an adaptation or like a inspired by or adjunct, some kind of
Yeah, that's more where I
ancillary
would
thing.
file it. But still, I mean, if you're a Phantom of the Opera collector, there's just so much cool shit out there to get, and a lot of it on the cheap too. I don't imagine too many of those public domain, like random reprints of the film cost too much.
Well,
Night of the Living Dead ones aren't hard to collect for the most part. There's like
and
a handful that are really rare and expensive, but
well, if you're
yeah.
talking about, I don't know if this counts or if this is cheating or not, but as far as like what other version would you recommend that's not this one? This might be kind of cheating, but so for 2011 there was the Phantom of the Opera at the Royal Albert Hall, and it was basically a filmed version of the stage show. But it wasn't just that, because they also at the very end they had all the different guys who have played the Phantom on the stage come on. Uh,
Dope.
it was awesome. Like, you saw Michael Crawford, you saw, like, the whoever the then current person was who played it for the rest of the show, but you saw all the different Phantoms all come on because it was about, I think it was the 25th anniversary. And it was recorded, and you can get it on Blu-ray and everything, but it's like, well, that brings the stage version home with you. Because again, the 2004 version, it adapts it pretty well, but it adds some stuff, it removes some stuff. The Royal Albert Hall, it's a great performance of it with a great cast. It keeps the original stage show's structure and all that stuff, but it also pays homage to all the other people that played the roles before. And it is the great music, and
Right.
it has a little bit more. The stage version had just the teensiest bit more horror in it that I think the movie perhaps it didn't have. But it's kind of got everything you'd want in one place while also doing justice to the stage appeal of it, and plot structure wise, being closer in its construction to this version, to the 25 one. So kind of helps tie it
It
all together.
definitely, I don't know if I'd call it cheating to include. I'd say that's a really strong honorable mention,
Yeah,
like in adjacent to the film version. Because, is it a movie?
not
No,
really,
but it's
but
it's as close as a stage production can be to being a movie. I mean, it was filmed and it had a physical release, so I'll
yeah.
allow it. That's
Well,
where we're at with that.
You can put it on your shelf and you can watch it, and it's well
Yeah.
worth it.
If you're going to become a Phantom collector, it sounds like one of those things you're going to want to check off the list straight away.
Yeah,
The more
it's
bizarrely, the more we talk about this, the more I do remember the Alvin and the Chipmunks.
mhm.
I feel like it was like the little chubby one that
Oh,
was the Phantom. Theodore, wasn't it?
well, there was Alvin is the
No,
red
Theodore's
one,
the nerdy
Theodore is
one,
the
I think.
nerdy blue one, and then Simon's the fat green one.
Yeah, I
And
feel like
I
it was him who was the Phantom in it.
fun fact about that. So when I worked at
I gotta confirm that.
The Blumenthal Performing Arts Center here in town, one of the shows that came here was Alvin and the Chipmunks live on stage, and that was one of the ones I was in charge of marketing, and it didn't do especially well, but it wasn't, it was enough to like fill the one or two performances, but it wasn't like a sellout or anything. But I remembered everybody in the office like bad mouthed it and put Alvin and his buddies down or his brothers down. And I was like, well, I was having to stick up for them. So I feel a sense of attachment to those little rodents in a way that I didn't feel before because everybody around them was kind of putting them down. I didn't think that was right. So then you take my attachment to the Phantom of the Opera as a story, and you've got an odd concoction that is very specific to me and
Oh
no
yeah,
one
dude.
else.
They did other Universal stuff too, for sure.
Because I think Universal had the rights to them at one point
See, I think
before.
I might be wrong on Simon being the Phantom in the Phantom thing that they did specifically, but I swear that like image is in my head of him. Maybe it's in one of the ones where they were wearing Halloween costumes or something.
Maybe I don't
Uh,
know, but
and that
you
in
know,
itself could be a nod to when they did the Phantom. But yeah, it's neat too for a while there, especially in like the late 80s and the 90s, how Universal monsters were kind of being pushed towards kids again. We've talked about this briefly in like
yeah,
unrecorded chats, but it was a good time to be a kid because
it
even though
really
we missed
was.
that stuff when it was new, we got it like a fresh round of it.
Well, and it's yeah, 80s, 90s was kind of in a weird way, it was kind of the last hurrah for those classic monsters as far as getting rediscovered and reappreciated and stuff because there was the original generation of people that would have seen those in the theater and they were really old at that point, but then like baby boomers rediscovered it on those films on television and re-releases and stuff, and then they made movies that celebrated them, and
Yeah.
then the home video releases like I mentioned, Universal put them out on VHS a couple times, and one of the most recent of the VHS era was 99. That's when I would have seen a lot of them. And then of course DVD, Blu-ray, etc. Now 4K with some of them, but I do feel like kids today they kind of treat a lot of the slasher films as the classics, and there James Rolfe put it a very good way. There's the golden age of films, of horror films, there's the silver age, and then there's the bronze age, and then there's the modern age. And slasher films, 80s slasher films would be the bronze age, and that's fair. So they're classics of that period, but I when I think of classic, I think of like gold and silver age stuff. But you kind of have to split them out that way in order to be fair because
Pretty much. I mean,
something can be a modern classic or a Bronze Age classic or a whatever.
yeah. I mean, those are the classics of our generation, but you're kidding yourself even if you don't appreciate these movies, like in terms of, stuff that you're going to go return to and watch frequently. You got to recognize it and give it the respect due for what it was, which was like the progenitors of the shit that we got in the 80s.
Well,
Uh,
yeah,
Basically the entirety of the 80s was them trying to, or in a lot of ways succeeding, to recreate that like roster of classic monsters again. We just didn't get them under one like umbrella, so there wasn't as much cohesiveness with it as it could have been. I mean, imagine the versus movies we could have got if all of those horror icons of the 80s were under one house.
yeah. Well,
um,
the best compliment I can give to this film specifically, but this story more broadly, and it is the advantage of public domain things in general, is that so there's a particular work of art comes out, It has its moment of time in the sun, if it ever does have its time in the sun. It grows old, it grows stale, and then it gets classic. It becomes a classic. It becomes or nostalgic, and then it becomes a classic if it does, and then it goes kind of past classic, and it becomes part of people's just overall cultural memory and cultural lexicon to the degree that they don't even know that they know it. Like I'm thinking of
Right.
like Mozart or Beethoven. It's like, people as old as their works are, centuries old, people still listen to their music. And people, I think, will still be watching this film and watching or just reading about the Phantom or watching another take on the Phantom, because it's up there. Narrative wise, it's up there with like Mozart or Beethoven or Bach or anything like that.
Oh
Um,
yeah. I mean, it's the type of thing that 100 years from now, even if somebody hasn't watched Phantom in a half century, they will still be plugging it into TV screens on horror films, I'm sure, or doing like scenes that are nods to it, because people that are our age will inevitably show our kids Phantom of the Opera, and it's got that timeless quality to it, and that it's important enough it'll still be seen by people and worked into that, like, overall, thought tank that is like the horror genre consistently over and over again.
Yeah, if I'm ever lucky enough to have kids, they are all gonna grow up on, the same stuff that I grew up on that was valuable, like stuff from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. The 50s, sci-fi movies like The Fly and Godzilla and, Creature from the Black Lagoon, which out of all the Universal monsters, just as monsters, let alone the movies that they came from, which Creature from the Black Lagoon is probably my personal favorite.
Agreed.
But then again, like this one pervades not just those movies, but it pervades just films and storytelling in general to such a stronger degree. But just like as a monster, I think the creature is my favorite. The Gill Man is my favorite. And from a movie that perhaps matches our sensibilities of film pacing and that sort of stuff perhaps a little bit closer, but it's you have to always give it up for the movies that are the bedrock of culture, and this one is definitely one of them.
Oh yeah.
Not just for horror, but just for films in general.
Right. I mean, we've done plenty tonight to illustrate, I think,
Yeah,
how
if
it
you don't know
definitely
it by
carried through.
now.
Yeah, in the DNA of horror specifically, but just in films, you're definitely right, because the whole, like, the general skeleton of the story is
Yeah.
something that's been told in a lot of different ways over all the years, and it's probably going to continue to be that way
Well,
for many years to come.
even something like a movie that most people haven't seen, and the few people I know who saw it, they tend to venomously hate it, and I don't know why, because it's one of my favorite movies of the 2010s. Was Martin Scorsese's Hugo. That film is directly inspired by the silent era, and specifically stories like The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, in that you have a lonely, discarded misfit of sorts who lives in a public building or a bustling building of sorts. In the Hunchback of Notre Dame's case, it's the cathedral, the Paris Cathedral. In Phantom of the Opera, it's the Opera Populaire, and then in Hugo, it's the train station. All in Paris, actually. Now that I think about it, Paris must just be a hotbed for those kinds of stories. But
I guess so.
I guess so. But it's just like, and that one's that person's not a deformed monster or anything. It's just a kid, just a lonely orphan
Right. I
kid.
mean, if you strip away the whole, horror monster element of this, and like the whole slightly rapey female abduction master slave thing that's
Hmm.
going on there, it really is just a tragic love story about like an introvert that's super creative, like finding, kindred spirit with somebody else that's like a creative performer or something.
Yeah.
And, you know, like wanting to be with that person, but not really having
being
the
able to do it. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and that's a big difference with Hugo is that Hugo Cabaret is not deformed. He's just a kid. And also, the conceit is not so much about love, but about finding meaning in a world that has torn away all of his hope and meaning. And so he thinks that by putting it into this mechanical man, that that will somehow give him his purpose. But it's a lot deeper than that. He finds his purpose by helping the filmmaker Georges Méliès rediscover his purpose.
Well,
So
there you go.
it
I
does
mean,
tie into the silent era very directly, and I want to say that they might have actually showed a clip from this film in that montage that they do. I can't remember if they do. I think they do, but they for sure show a clip of Nosferatu in there. So
hey, and building a mechanical man beats the hell out of snatching chicks from the opera house.
and he does manage to have, the child romance version of, yeah, a child's version of romance with Chloe Grace Moretz when she was a kid herself, and so
Hey,
he didn't come out too badly on that front.
not at all. Wouldn't mind how. I mean, she's of age, right?
Yeah, not nowadays she
Probably
is.
check before. Okay.
Yeah, now she
Yeah,
is, and
I was gonna say I
she's
wouldn't
very
mind having
pretty.
the adult version of that with her these days, but
Yeah, she's very pretty.
yeah, she gets some flack for that role she did in what was it, the Let Me In, which was like the remake of Let the Right One In.
Yeah,
But
which I never
I
saw that.
liked it.
I knew her from Hugo and from Kick Ass.
Yeah, if you should really have you seen Let the Right One In?
Yes, I have, and I love that
Yeah,
film.
it's great, but you should definitely watch that remake eventually.
Which I've heard good
Uh,
things about it. But
yeah,
yeah,
if you're like some purist that can't handle there being slight differences, you might be annoyed at certain parts, but for the most part, it's the same, which seemed to be the main criticism it got.
hmm
Which I feel that, if you're going to remake something, at least add a little something. It seems like with Phantom, that's pretty consistent across the board, that they did a little bit different with each version of it that's been done. Or the ones that stayed more faithful did it in an updated enough way that it was like cool.
yeah,
Uh,
because I think a lot of purists of the stage musical of Phantom of the Opera probably didn't like some of the deletions and the revisions to and additions to the 2004 one, but I think for the most part they worked to streamline the story a little bit more cinematically and to kind of help to make it a little something that's not just a carbon copy. And that's I think that's why adaptation is kind of its own art, because the whole point of it is to not just translate it, but to bring something new to it that
exactly.
can't be
I mean,
found
I
in
think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
it can't be found in the original medium.
Right. Like, I mean, I think, especially, coming at this as a horror fan, first and foremost, you kind of go through that stage where you're like, oh, unless it's spot for spot the same as the original, I'm just going to be bummed on it and hate on it and nitpick it to death and say that it shouldn't have happened. But then as I've gotten older, I've noticed, like, okay, The Omen, that's a good example of one that's like too close to the original. So when I watch it now, I'm just like, oh, this is pretty pointless. It's just
Yeah.
the same movie updated.
Well, when
So
I
I
was
think as a film like viewer, a film fan, and especially as a horror fan, you go through your evolutionary process with it, where at first you want it to be dead on accurate,
yeah.
but then over time you realize that just makes the source material stale almost.
Yeah, what's the point of it? Because like I used to be that way too. I was so much more of a purist in when
I
I was
hated the
younger.
fucking Dawn of the Dead remake when I first saw it, dude, but now I actually kind of love that movie.
Yeah, I
So,
actually kind of like the remake more than the original, even though
in a lot of ways, yeah.
the original is great in and of itself. Like it's kind of an apples and oranges thing, but I kind of prefer the
True enough,
remake a
but I
little
think
bit.
like any days, yeah, I kind of, depending on my mood, I for sure prefer it, and even despite my mood, they're at least equal to me. I
Yeah,
think nowadays.
well, but you're right. The because I used to be much more of a purist, but like the conclusion that I came to over time is like you stick too rigidly close to the text or the whatever the original source is, you stick too rigidly close to it, then not only does it make it stale, but at some point you're like, well, what's the point of doing it exactly the
Yeah.
same?
How are you having fun making it as a filmmaker if you're
And
just
that's
reshooting someone's shit?
part of the part of I think the point of you can debate back and forth as to exactly why he did this because he gave a few related answers that weren't exactly the same. But like I'm thinking of Gus Van Sant's Psycho. That was the most
Yeah.
literal version of a remake that you could possibly make. I think that was part of the point was to remake it, make it again, and exactly almost exactly the way it was, but updated for modern times with color and with some changes in the how much things cost and stuff like that, but not change it that much. And so that it's an interesting experiment, not really
Yeah.
a good
As a
movie in and of
filmmaking
itself.
exercise, it's probably fun to do like once, you know.
Yeah, it was a
Uh,
novelty, and I think now one of the answers that he gave to it was he gave a couple different answers. One of which was, you know, it wouldn't be a remake to change everything around. When he said, when I hear remake, I think remake it, make it again. And then the other answer that he gave to Roger Ebert, because he asked him why did he do the Psycho remake, and he said so no one else would have to. And so in that way, you could say that it was sort of like the ultimate kind of sacrifice of sorts, as like, well, you want to do a remake, well, this is the most literal version of a remake that could possibly exist, and so there you go. I died for your sins, shall we say.
yeah. I mean, I figure at best it's probably a combo of the two answers.
Hmm.
If he gave the previous one first, I would say that's probably more his position on it. Which you could in itself say is him like kind of saying the fuck you to him in a way.
Yeah.
Because Psycho didn't need to be remade, but
No, it did
I
not.
mean that's a perfect example of a remake that I would have praised at a certain point, but now I'm kind of like, I mean it's I have it in the collection, but it's not one that I'd pop in, you know.
Well, and the difference, I think, and this is, I bring it all up not to distract from the larger point, but rather to say that stories like The Phantom of the Opera, they can withstand many, many retellings and many different takes on the story that can be similar to each other, or they can deviate somewhat, they can deviate wildly, whatever it is. It can withstand it because, again, the story is so archetypical and it's so baked into our psychology as human beings. Beauty and the Beast is an incredibly archetypical story, as is this, which is again kind of a cousin of that archetype.
Right.
So there's a reason why it can withstand many different adaptations, some close, some not so close, and some that take influence from the other. Psycho is a very specific story in a very specific time and place in American
Yeah, as
history.
iconic as it is, it's not that archetype of us, like you're saying, that's so ingrained in all of us that you can get away with like just doing it again with some slight alterations, you
Yeah,
know.
you can't. And
Um,
so while it is indeed an interesting experiment in just filmmaking, and one that I think was perhaps worth trying once, maybe not with Psycho, but just in general. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Definitely not. Here's a this could be a topic for a whole other episode. Imagine an alternate universe in which the Gus Van Sant Psycho was actually a big hit. Can you imagine all of the other classic films?
fucking samey remakes we would have gotten.
I
I think I
know.
get where you're going with it. It would have
Yeah.
been a bleak existence to be sure. And you
Well,
would never would have caught me dead saying that at 17. I would have been like, yes, that's exactly the way it should have been, you
well,
know, but
it
we're
would have
because
been like the colorization. It would have been like the colorization mini boom of sorts. I hate to say it because
yeah,
it didn't
and we
catch
didn't
on
need
as
that
much.
and we all regret it now. So
Yeah,
let's just
and that
never
because
go
that
down that route again.
it attempted to catch on in the 80s and it didn't. in a weird way, you could maybe even say that a little bit to a lesser extent of like when The Wizard of Oz got re-released in theaters in 2013 to try to combat it was Warner Brothers trying to combat Oz the Great and Powerful, which Disney put out, but they re-released The Wizard of Oz and they put it in 3D, and it's like, come on, this movie from 1939 is getting put in 3D. It's like, come on,
I feel like
they
they were
never
well aware
intended
people
for
were
that.
taking acid and watching it by then, though.
Well, they never intended for they had no come on, that's just ridiculous,
Like, I
but
could see being on a hefty amount of hallucinogens and really enjoying that.
yeah.
Uh,
Well, but
but
you get what I'm saying is, like, there are
right, I mean,
certain things that they try to make it fit the technological trend or the whatever trend, and some of it can work, some of it really doesn't. And I can only imagine an alternate universe in which his Psycho was a big hit, and then all of the really stale remakes that we would have gotten that were all just replicating the same thing but with updated actors and in color and stuff like that. That would have been a nightmare. But then you think, tying it back into horror, all of the remakes that we did get in the 2000s, some of which really worked, some of which didn't, most of which didn't, and like how that was its own trend for a while.
still
And
kinda is. I mean,
yeah,
there's remnants of it left today, and the thing is, it always did happen. I mean, we got some great ones in the '80s, but I think the thing with the '80s was, and I guess it's not too far removed now, but a lot of the stuff from the '80s was from, like, 30 years prior, and I guess the stuff they're remaking now is from 30 years prior now. It's just we're the 30-year-olds now, so we're
I
like,
know.
ugh.
Well,
But,
and again,
some of them
it's
are
not the
good. Evil
same.
Dead is a great example of, like, an
Yeah,
absolutely fucking banging remake. But even going back to the '90s, which is a decade a lot of horror fans write off for whatever reason. Yeah, it wasn't the '80s, but there was still some great stuff. The Night of the Living Dead remake they did back then with Tony Todd. That one's just
oh,
now starting to get the appreciation it properly deserves because
yeah,
it's
yeah,
actually solid. It's kind of the opposite of, it's sort of the same, but the opposite of the Psycho one, where they did
yeah,
enough of it the same that it feels like a proper, homage to the original. But they changed up some stuff, like Barbara's an ass kicker in it.
yeah, yeah.
So it's, you got to have some difference.
Keep in mind that you cannot include the Phantom of the Opera in that, pantheon for the simple reason that, when it's based on a source novel that's that old, it's more of a readaptation of that novel, so it's not necessarily like a remake of a specific film necessarily,
Right.
unless it's like a Wizard of Oz situation where some of them derive more heavily from the books, but a good chunk of them are at least aware enough of the 39 version to where they're either gonna take after it in a lot of ways, or they're gonna do something wildly different to distinguish themselves from
Yeah,
it.
there's enough of a spread with the Phantom ones that they've got, there's enough examples of either or both to
Yeah,
kind of like set it apart. I mean, one example I use of the source material argument is The Thing from Another World and The Thing.
yeah,
I don't consider The Thing a remake. It's based on the same book
yeah, who's
that,
there?
yeah, so it shares source material with that other Thing movie from, like, whenever it was, the '50s or whatever.
Yeah, and
Um,
you can honestly, you can tell the difference between a new adaptation versus a remake. I think you can,
for
because
sure, and I
well,
mean, even the Phantom timeline is a good example of that because, dude, we have everything from, basic Universal redoing it all the way to Phantom of the Paradise to
yeah,
Chris Seaver's version. There's so many different whacked out versions of Phantom or stage musical adaptations, or, it seems like it truly does run the gamut of every type of an adaptation of it that you could get. There's
yeah.
probably random, like, low budget '80s horror ones we're not even aware of.
Well, and also, like, I've been doing all the Alice in Wonderland, adaptations and stuff, and, that was a old book, several decades old, by the time that they started to first make film adaptations of it in like 1903 and stuff like that. And there was the very next one is 1910. And it's like, well, that wasn't called a remake of the film. It was just another
Yeah,
adaptation of
it's
the
just
book.
another
And
adaptation.
yeah, and especially when it's based on source material that's quite old like that, and especially if it's gotten public domain status and it's part of the lexicon, it's part of the culture and all that stuff, or it is a like a Disney film that's based on a fairy tale, pretty explicitly a fairy tale, like by the Brothers Grimm or by just whatever, then it really is not a remake unless like Disney, like if they do a live action Beauty and the Beast, well, they're obviously basing it off of their own take on the story, but that's different because that's them doing it to themselves as opposed to like someone else trying to recapture their own magic, and so
I
it's
mean, a
there's a
modern
noticeable
example
difference.
or a newer example, I guess you could say, is like the Conan movie that they did with
Jason
Aquaman,
Momoa,
whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, that dude. Like, I didn't ever really think of that as a Conan remake because I was aware of the fact that there's like a billion Robert E. Howard stories that all the
Hmm.
shit is kind of loosely drawn from. So it was just another version of Conan. I never looked at it as him taking Arnold Schwarzenegger's place. I just looked at him as another dude that played Conan.
I
And he
think
did fine
it's
for
I,
young
th-
Conan.
I think it's honestly, you know what it is, I think it's a literature thing. Literature, I think, is able to be more properly contextualized and categorized as, adaptation or readaptation as opposed to like a remake, because when the source material is another film or it's best known as another
Yeah, then
film that
you're always gonna tie it to
yes,
that thing. Whereas
you're
when it's a book, it's kind of more open ended or less so, depending on how much of a purist you are. But
well,
uh,
and it's especially again the older that book is and the more kind of cultural legacy it has just as a story, like Phantom, Dracula, Frankenstein, all of those have original source novels, and they're all so heavily ingrained in people's just collective consciousness that that they don't even think about it really, in that respect, then it's like it doesn't carry that stigma that remakes tend to carry, and I think, again, it just comes down to what was the original source medium and how old is it? Um, but
true enough.
you can get away with it when it's literature or a fairy tale or a, folklore or something like that,
Yeah, well,
some
you're remaking Freddy fucking Krueger or something. You're not gonna get the same leeway that you would get with.
yeah, no way, and especially when it's, something that's, like, a really specific character that a particular company owns, like a Freddy Krueger, then you're gonna face even more scrutiny with it,
Yeah, it's a
and,
slippery slope that you're pretty much gonna end up at the bottom of most of the time, at least at
yeah.
first.
Well, the one that, kinda treads that line a little bit is, Willy Wonka, because Willy Wonka also has a literary source. There's more than one Willy Wonka book, or more Charlie book, I should say. There's more than one of those, um, but so that does have a literary source to it. Most people, kind of like the Wizard of Oz, most people here in the United States have seen Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. So when Charlie and the Chocolate Factory came out, it had more of that remake stench to it than it perhaps necessarily deserved, given the
I
source.
dug it.
Yeah,
I
I
thought it
liked
was
it
pretty
too.
cool.
I liked it too for what it was. But I mentioned that as a readaptation because
Right,
it
yeah, it's
it,
kinda
it
in one of those movies falls in that gray area where it is that, but a lot of people aren't aware that there's books.
yeah.
So
Well,
or
and
that it's comes from a different source than, your average remake, so they're just only gonna compare it to that movie.
exactly, but it's important that we're specifying these things because you do not see that in with this film in the way that you do with things that are based on properties that are perhaps not
No, yeah, I
not
think
as
it blends
ingrained in the cultural consciousness on an archetypical
right.
level.
I think a combination of that and it being so goddamn old, which on that note, it really does feel like it fits in fine with the stuff from the 30s and the 40s.
Yeah,
Other than the print of the movie not being kept better, it looks as good as a lot of those, in my opinion,
I think
uh,
so.
or actually better than some of them.
Yeah,
But it. I think a combination of it being that, like you said, being so ingrained, and it being so old, people are more inclined to just take whatever their generation's Phantom was as their generation's Phantom and be happy with it. And then, while this dude is neglected, again, we gotta, as we've touched on, everybody kind of knows this version of the Phantom on some
yeah.
level as well. So it's not as if he's completely shunned. He's just sort of on the outside of that main pantheon of universal monsters that we've always kind of had crammed at us. You know what I mean?
Well,
Uh,
and we talked about like the kind of the nowadays kind of some of the incel aspects of the Phantom and stuff like that, or that
it's
sort of
there.
stuff, and that's well, but it is there, but at the same
It
time,
wasn't so
like
much of a thing back then. You were able to get away with being a little more aggressive and
well,
vengeful and rapey.
not only that, but in all fairness, I think part of the uh, speaking of archetypes and everything, I think part of what makes this story and Beauty and the Beast and things like that, I think part of what makes those stories endure so much is that you know very few of us look like the Phantom or the Beast, and presumably we don't kidnap girls and try to get them to love us and stuff like that. But I think everybody
Talk
knows.
about your reptile venom. Yeah, we don't do
Yeah,
that.
well, but everybody, even the most beautiful amongst us, I think everyone at some point in their lives feels like the ugly duckling, or they feel like the odd man out, or they
Oh
feel
yeah,
like they feel alienated in their lives in some way. It's what makes, and tying it back to Tim Burton, it's what makes Tim Burton films what they are, because they're very popular with the mainstream, despite the fact that most people don't look like Edward Scissorhands and probably never will look like Edward Scissorhands.
everybody has that awkward period though, feeling like they don't fit in for a while. I
Exactly.
mean, it's part of the human condition, and
Exactly. And that's what this film speaks to on an archetypical level. Um, and that's again why it endures so much, because again, very few of us look that way, and we're certainly not going to do a lot of those behaviors. But I think his feeling in life is based on enough universal feelings that it's what carries
yeah,
us through.
and that's jokes aside, we should point out that the whole Phantom thing is obviously based on, like you're saying, like those basic built-in feelings. It's not meant to be read into too much.
No,
We're mostly saying that because it's funny.
and it is
It
funny,
is
and
funny.
I do stand by what I said. Don't give this guy a computer, because
Yeah,
I do think that this guy would he would do one of two things. He would either like use it to explicitly like stalk women and stuff like that, or he would just be one of those guys on the forums like being a troll and a hater, or like saying really misogynistic things and just playing video games the whole time,
yeah.
not actually
He'd turn
making
that lair
music.
into like the ultimate fucking nerd cave through Amazon
Which
orders and just
Which
be
I
down
mean,
there just
it
trolling like
kind of
crazy.
it kind of already is,
Yeah, for the
in
time.
for
It's
the
dope.
time, and in terms of like the opera props, the organ, the fact that he's in a literal man cave, pretty much, Paris Opera House version of that, but it's like uh, you look at other versions of it, and it's like, man, I could do with these kinds of digs. I think that'd be
Yeah.
awesome.
Hell yeah. Especially even with all the trip getting down there. It's like got that good atmosphere.
Well, and here's okay, so here's an interesting kind of thematic a parallel, but some notable differences. So you've got the Phantom and you've got Quasimodo, also deformed, also played by Lon Chaney, also in Paris, of all things, another iconic building. Instead of the opera house, it's the cathedral. I think both of which burned down one in real life, and then I think the Paris Opera House did burn down at
I
one
feel
point.
like that sounds familiar. Yeah.
Well, but then here's the other thing. So the Phantom lives down in the depths, underneath the opera house, underneath the city, and
Oh yeah,
then and
Quasimodo's
then
kind of the opposite end.
yeah, Quasimodo lives above, high above the city, and not just that, but in a church. And a church is all about looking skyward to God, ascending, the human spirit ascending. And so, isn't that interesting? You got the
It
one
is.
monster is down in the depths, and then the other one is closer to heaven.
And isn't Quasimodo kind of a little bit more benevolent?
Yeah, he's more of a good guy to be. He's more of I wouldn't say anti-hero, but he's a monster with a heart. Which is not to say
Right.
that the Phantom doesn't have a heart. It's just his heart's broken, of course, and he does terrible things because of it. But that's again thematically, symbolically, that's very important, I think.
It is, man. I mean, at its core, especially if we'd been given like the redemption arc that apparently is present in the book at the very end of the film, it
Hmm.
might have made for like less watchable of a movie, but I'm sure other versions have incorporated that. I feel like you mentioned a couple, maybe even.
Well,
Uh,
one of my favorite things that the 2004 version did differently than the stage musical. So the stage musical ends like he sits down in his throne, he wraps his cape around himself, and then the angry mob and stuff, they come down, they pull his cape off, and he's gone. So presumably there would have been a trapdoor or something. It's like an optical illusion. But the 2004 version, you see an elderly Raoul leaving roses at the grave of Christine, who by that point, it's many, many years later. By that point, she would have been a mother and died and, led a big full life and
right.
everything. Leaves flowers at her grave. And then there's one single black rose with a ribbon that's left at
Nice.
her grave. So the Phantom never forgot her. And I
Okay,
was
so we kind of get like a little bit of a hint at maybe something with that.
Exactly. So I
I
so
like
that
it.
that and that was something I was like, okay, so maybe that version's maybe not perfect, but that's a touch that I was like, oh, that's good stuff.
I
Because
dig it.
again, no dialogue for that section, just a visual, and we get it.
Well, my main point with it was though, like apparently that the original ending he gets to redeem his humanity a little bit more. And
Yeah.
as we've touched on it, even though the malevolent sort of sinister, gleefully sadistic part of him is more prevalent in the final product of a film that we get to see,
Mm-hmm.
we do know that originally the ending was supposed to have him, emphasize that humanity that is hinted at even in this version of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Because he does say, like, you make the good in me come out,
Yeah, yeah.
basically. So we know that this dude has like a good side to him too. So you could argue Phantom is one of the early movies to kind of really show that like behind the monstrosity there is a good person there still.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
and
And
that's something they
that's
carried on in other Universal monster movies later on for sure.
yeah.
And obviously Quasimodo has some of that going on as well. But it's interesting to note, because a lot of people tend to ridicule movies like these for being like, oh, well, that's the origin of like the deformed people being scary trope. And it's like, yeah, you might be right,
Well, but
but I think when that stuff's handled
deformed
right,
people were hated and feared long before there were ever movies made
I'm
about
talking
them.
about movies, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that. I posted somewhere about Pet Cemetery and Zelda being scary a while back, and somebody was like, "Yeah, it's all, the overused trope of
Mhm.
deformed people being scary." And it's like, let's be honest, dude. They kind of are sometimes to people. I mean, like anything unfamiliar is going to be unsettling sometimes until you see the human behind it.
Uh-huh.
You know
Well,
what I
and
mean?
and again,
Obviously,
it's
as actual people, we know to look for that first before just immediately being repulsed by somebody who looks that different to like other humans that we see. But in
mhm.
the context of a horror film, you can understand what they're playing off there.
Yeah.
So, I could see criticizing it for that, but to be like offended by it is a little silly.
Well,
Uh,
and again, to be fair, people were afraid of that stuff long before there ever was movies made about, people like that. And if anything, it's more of a sign of better, just overall understanding of people,
Yeah,
that a lot of the
that's what
time
I'm getting
that
at. Like,
yeah.
the Phantom clearly is supposed to have that message to it somewhere in there, even though we got essentially an alternate ending tacked onto this, which I'm thankful for. I fucking love it.
Mhm.
But, it is important to note that it, does have that hint at it earlier, and it was originally supposed to end in a more sympathetic way for Eric. I think we
Mhm.
failed to mention his actual name. It is
Yes.
Eric, which is kind of boring.
Well, no,
You
I think
know,
I mentioned it earlier on, but no,
I think you might have said something about it, but yeah, that
I didn't really emphasize it. Although, well, it's okay. So funny you say it's boring, because like I one of my favorite things about it, I do like the name Eric in general. I think it's a very strong name. Um,
yeah, it's got
so
some good Viking lineage.
it does, but then I also thought about when I was a kid, Eric was the name of the prince in The Little Mermaid, at least the Disney version. I don't think the
It is
prince
true.
had that name in the original story, but
I don't
then
know. I'm only familiar in my scholarly travels with the Disney version and the
yeah.
Disney video game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which
Well,
is pretty awesome.
but that Eric was ERIC, and then this Eric is
With a
ERIK,
K, a
and
little more
that's a little
hardcore.
bit more badass, yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought about both of those because I was like, well, both of these stories were very foundational for me, kind of as a kid, and those were both, you know, both the same name, different spellings, different kind of connotations with it, and I always thought to myself, well, if I ever had a son, I would love to name him Eric, but I would love to give him the ERIK.
Well, dude, and like you said earlier, like looking at movies that are sort of alternate versions of this, or this is like an alternate version of Beauty and the Beast. Well, Little Mermaid is almost like at least the Disney version is like an alternate version of this if Eric got the ability to go above like ground and look like everyone for a while. Like if Ariel was just down there getting all sexually frustrated, spitting toad venom or whatever,
Uh-huh.
she
Yeah.
might have started sinking some boats if she didn't eventually get to play human for a while.
Well, in that one, the creature that wants to be with the normal person is the woman, and it's one who is not deformed in any way. She's quite beautiful. She's just not
Well,
human.
except for the fishy parts, you know what
Yeah,
I mean?
the fishy parts that get in the way of the other necessary parts.
I don't know if Eric knew his way around a blowhole, if you feel
I,
me.
I don't think so, or gills or whatever. But yeah,
We
that
saw
would
the lighthouse, if that's
be
what
a,
it looks like. I
that'd
don't
be a
know.
little complicated. Which I love the lighthouse specifically
Oh,
because,
that's amazing.
well, because it's so rooted in mermaid lore and in the tales that seamen would tell each other.
Yeah.
But no, but that one, the Little Mermaid's different though, because again, the creature is female, and she is quite beautiful, and yet it's still not quite. She's not quite up to what she needs to be up to be with the person that she wants to be with. Um, so that is kind of a different take on things. But no,
Yeah, it feels like a little bit of a
well,
different angle on it, you know?
but if I ever had a son, I would love to name him Eric, with that spelling. And then funny part about that is that if I ever had a girl, I would really love to name her Christine, because I do genuinely love that name.
If I
And I
had to bed down one or the other, I'm definitely going Ariel with the blowhole, but
I
I
love
feel
the name
bad for the
Ariel too,
Phantom.
and I
I
actually
feel
thought
bad
about
for
that
Eric,
too.
so I might let him watch, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Well, I
Stop
actually
spitting that toad venom, bro.
I love the name Ariel too, and I would love to throw that in the hopper as far as like possible names for the future, if I'm ever lucky enough for it.
So
But
would you agree that with this film, I mean, obviously the standout scenes are, like in terms of big spectacle would be Chandelier Falling,
face
reveal
reveal.
of the Phantom, Mask of the Red Death,
Yeah.
and then the whole final confrontation kind of wrapped into a whole.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you had to pick like favorite moments or bits outside of that, what would be kind of your
Well,
ones you'd throw out.
for the one you didn't mention in there, which is heightened all the more by the color tinting, is the rooftop scene because of the red cape
Oh well, yeah, true.
against the blue surroundings and
I
everything. I
mostly
mean,
think of that more as like part of the whole Mask of the Red Death, like ballroom
yeah,
sequence there.
I would say no to that part for the simple reason that the Red Death part, that the Masquerade Ball, so that's in full color.
True. Well,
The
I mean,
part with the
visually,
cape
obviously, it's
the part with the
separated,
cape is hand painted.
which
So
is
it's a
glorious, especially when you see it billowing.
yeah, it's glorious in its own right. I love it to death. It's just it's not quite the same thing. It's related, but it's not quite the same thing.
For you
Uh,
future travelers coming back in time to watch this episode, it will be linked in the description, the version that both of us watched, so you
yes,
can
it
check
is
it
on
out.
YouTube. I was consulting it as we were going through this because I had put the Blu-ray back on my shelf. But that's a standout specifically for that version that I'm thinking of. But just in general, I think that is a standout moment. But then also like the standout moment that I don't think gets as celebrated is the I'm a voice from the shadows and all that stuff. Like
Yes.
I think that's a standout moment. And then the other part that I had kind of forgotten about was the fact that they're in all those traps, and that the heat room, the mirror room, the flooding, and all that stuff. I mean, Jigsaw would later come along and kind of
Dude,
take that to an art
yes.
form.
That flooding was fucking violent. I'm not even
Hmm.
joking, guys. If you've not seen it, those were real dudes at the back of the room, I'm pretty sure, in that wide shot.
Yeah. Well,
And I don't think they knew it was going to flood that hard, because those dudes look fucking terrified.
and it
Uh,
floods quickly. That's the thing. Like it
yeah,
fills up with water really fast. And even if it didn't flood, it was full of gunpowder. So it was either death by drowning or death by blowing up. And
right. But I mean, just removing like the reality of the film, like just those dudes at the back of that room when they flash flooded it, that's like kind of deserves some credit for just crazy stunt work and like big movie set pieces. I mean, they flooded it hard.
it's dangerous.
Uh,
Well, keep in mind
yep.
that one of the, I want to say it was like the Cecil B. DeMille's original version of the Ten Commandments, not the '50s one with Charlton Heston, but the one before that in the '20s. I believe that was the correct one. If not that, it might have been a early version of Noah's Ark. It was one of those two, but a lot of people got drowned in that for real because of just the
Oh
sheer
shit.
volume of water that was used. And that was back in the days when there were really no stuntmen in the way that we think of it today. There
Yeah, no,
were
there was no professional person on set to just be that dude most of the time,
no, it
because it
was
wasn't even thought of.
no, then there were very few like real workers protections in
Yeah, fucking.
any workplace, let alone the film industry. And
They
it's
for
like,
real trampled several people during the chandelier scene. So
yeah, I
honorable
mean,
mention to that. I mean, it's
yeah.
like I don't know if they got hurt seriously, but it looked like it fucking hurt.
Well, it was
Uh,
point being, cinema was pretty
it was
filmmaking in
rough and
general was
tumble.
pretty hardcore back then, but
Yeah.
it was also a pretty rough and tumble, just unproven industry in general. Just
Right. And that's where this, stuff like this
artistically.
gets a lot of credit, I think, in my mind, from people like Savini when he was starting out, or like, okay, the idea of Lon Chaney showing up to set with his little box of makeups kind of got phased out in the larger studio sense later on when they started having like dedicated special effects teams working on stuff. But your average DIY dude still shows up very much in the spirit of Lon Chaney with his box of makeups. And while this was big studio stuff back then in the silent era, in a lot of ways it was still had that DIY spirit, because like you said, they were still figuring out how to make movies, so
Mhm.
they weren't going to just be able to hire a team of dudes that could Lon Chaney people. That's
Yeah.
why he was the man of 1,000 faces. So
Yeah.
it's yet another element of Phantom that is present in horror filmmaking to this day, you know, that is just awesome to me. I mean, I love the idea of some dude in like an Iron Maiden t-shirt showing up with a big cardboard box from the liquor store full of props and effects that he's made to make this little movie happen, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that is directly, you could trace that lineage all the way back to Lon Chaney himself, and that's pretty brilliant.
Well, heck,
But outside of that, oh,
if
did you
you
have a secondary favorite?
if you wanted to do, hey, okay, here's your challenge for all you up and coming filmmakers out there and people who have nostalgia for the video store and stuff, recreate a video store somewhere and then do an adaptation of this story, but it's the Phantom of the Video Store, where the Phantom's
Oh
underneath
yeah,
underneath the video store.
Phantom of the
Um,
Video Stop.
why not? You could do it. It's public
Let's do it,
domain.
Dan.
Yeah. I'd
We
I'd
could
be
play the
down.
Phantom.
I'd be down for it. Well, I do think that
We have to have gore in it though, if I'm gonna do
oh,
it.
and again, plenty of opportunities for that in this story as well. I think, yeah,
You poison the
probably,
popcorn maker and it just gets everybody in the store sick that fucking
or
has
or like you
some of the free popcorn.
put someone's head in the popcorn maker and watch it
Oh, we're
pop.
doing that for sure.
uh I think that voice from the shadows part, that's probably that's not like one of the more famous moments, but it really really made an impression on me growing up. And then I don't think that the ending carriage chase gets enough praise either, because that's a pretty tense moment there, tense
Yeah, people
climax.
tend to, it seems, skip right over that to the finale with him in the fake out and everything like that. But he looks totally fucking unhinged during that carriage scene while he's whipping the horses and like
Hmm.
looking over his shoulder and smiling as the wind's whipping through his face. I mean, Lon Chaney looks like he had an absolute blast making this movie. And that can't go understated. It's a huge
Hmm.
element when you're watching it. You can tell that this dude was into it and he was relishing like every moment of it.
Totally. And that
So,
translates onto the screen and onto the audience as well.
oh, for sure, you can feel it, man. And I think we've done a pretty good job of just illustrating to the scope of phantomness that's out there for you guys to enjoy.
Yes.
Get that copy of Phantom of the Paradise, might as well. I'm pretty sure that's probably right on the cusp of going out of print if it isn't.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
so.
and get out there and check out the many different versions of this. I'm kind of inspired through this conversation with Dane to get out there and maybe look at a few different prints of Phantom, kind of feel out which ones. I mean, I don't see too many topping this in the overall experience, but I feel like there's some of those other more atmospheric scenes that I might like in pure black and white. So I'm definitely going to explore the different prints of the film that exist, and I would recommend that everybody do that as well. And if in the future you come back and watch this, let us know what your personal favorite version of the Phantom is.
Yeah. And if you are a storyteller of your own sort, whether it's filmmaking or writing or whatever it is, the Phantom of the Opera is indeed public domain. So if you want to make your crazy video store gory version of it, you can. If you want to make
Yeah,
your sweet romantic version of it, you can. If you want to make your sweet romantic version that is also violent and gory and set in a video store, you can. The floodgates are open.
do it. And Lon Chaney would be proud of you, just
Yes.
especially if you have someone showing up doing some sweet DIY makeup. So
Absolutely, but yes,
I guess
do it.
that leaves us with your info, Dane. Give us those personal stats. What's your
Yes,
power
indeed.
level?
Well, I it's over 9,000.
Fuck yeah.
No, I'm Dane Keil. My YouTube channel is Dangerous Arts, DANEJUROUS Arts, and I've done my own short films that have kind of been influenced by. So I did my own silent film that was called Eternus, and it was inspired by, well, this film and Metropolis, Nosferatu, Charlie Chaplin films, and it was also a very archetypical story, and most directly based on Frankenstein, in fact. But I also have been doing a lot of deep dives into public domain stories and their various adaptations. I did one in October of this year called Oztober, which can be seen. 31 days, 31 different Oz film and TV
Absolutely amazing.
adaptations.
Don't miss
Working
it,
on,
folks.
yes, please, and working on April in Wonderland right now, set to debut in April 2022. um, Doing it many, many months in advance because it is quickly turning into its own kind of production. It's not just a series of reviews. There's a story arc that goes throughout it, and I'm trying to make it bigger and better than Oztober was. But after that's done, then I'll do other things like I'm going to dive into Dracula, Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, Peter Pan. Just a lot of basically these classical archetypical stories that have been adapted many times because they are public domain, and the goal of it is to analyze what people have done in the past so that you wannabe filmmaker or storyteller can see what's been done, and you can be inspired to go out and tell your own story based on this public domain source, because they're archetypical for a reason and they've lasted the test of time for a reason. So, it's meant to inspire you to go do that, and I'm doing that in my own form and fashion in the process.
Indeed. And certain people that you guys are already familiar with might be appearing in his next
Indeed,
series, and
indeed.
possibly several others. Would it be safe to say that we'll see you back here in the future on Cinema Slut Podcast, Dane?
I am never doing this again. This was just horrible. Horrible. I am so offended. No, I will be back many, many times, I would think.
Yeah, we got some ground to cover for sure, not only with Universal stuff, but with other types of films as well.
Indeed.
You guys already know I'm Mosley. You can find me over at the newly minted Retro Cult Home Video YouTube channel, doing discussions with these guys through Inside Movies Galore. Usually every Tuesday. I think we have White Christmas coming up on Tuesday.
It's that, or I can't remember if it's that or if it's a Wonderful Life. It's one of those two.
Yeah, I should probably figure that out and get
Yeah,
that taken
I
care
can't
of.
remember either.
But yeah, I do that stuff, and I've got a ton of Full Moon Madness content coming out over at the Retro Cult channel here in the near future. So look forward to that. And, hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. I think that we did this justice. We got to meander around and hit all our points and talk about the various aspects of the film.
And
we didn't get
it's
too
other
bogged down in the details, and we definitely
it's
did a
other
good job.
versions.
Yeah, of giving you guys a solid place to start as far as exploring other adaptations or versions of this film. So
Yeah.
get out there and have some fun with it, guys. That's what it's all about.
Yes, absolutely. Let the music of the night live on in your heart in whatever form or fashion it will.
Yeah, spit that reptile venom. We'll see you guys
That
back
too.
here next time on the Cinema Slut Podcast.
Nighty night.